The mall was chaos. Last-minute shoppers packed every store, fighting over sales and scavenging for anything left on the shelves. The sound of holiday music blaring over the speakers was barely audible over the hum of voices and the occasional screech of a child who'd had enough. I'd put off Christmas shopping longer than I should have, and now I was paying for it. My list was small. Gifts for my sister, my nephew, and something nice for my mom. But it still felt like an impossible task in the dwindling hours before Christmas. I weaved through the aisles of a department store, scanning shelves of perfumes, socks, and novelty gift sets, hoping something would jump out at me. That's when I felt it, a faint prickle at the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, just a quick look. A man stood at the end of the aisle, his hands in his coat pockets. He was tall and thin, with a blank expression that didn't quite meet his eyes. At first, I thought nothing of it. There were dozens of people milling about, all looking just as lost as I felt. But as I moved to the next aisle, he followed. I stopped in front of a shelf of scarves, pretending to browse. He stopped too, lingering a few feet behind me. My stomach tightened. Was he just shopping? Or was he watching me? I tested the theory, walking toward the electronics section on the other side of the store. The man kept pace, maintaining the same distance as before. He wasn't picking anything up, wasn't looking at the displays. He was just there, always close. By the time I reached the toy section, my unease had turned to frustration. I spun around, catching his gaze. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's expression didn't change. For a moment, he just stared at me, his head tilting slightly, as if he were studying something faintly amusing. Then he smiled, a small, cold curve of his lips, and walked away without a word. I stood there, rooted in place, as he disappeared into the crowd. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was nothing, just some weirdo playing games. I forced myself to finish my shopping, checking over my shoulder every few minutes, but the man didn't appear again. It wasn't until hours later, when I pulled into my driveway, that I saw him again. The street was quiet, snow covering the lawns and sidewalks in a thick, undisturbed blanket. My breath fogged the air as I stepped out of the car, juggling bags of poorly wrapped gifts. That's when I noticed the car parked across the street. It was an older sedan, dark blue, with its engine idling faintly in the cold. The man was sitting in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the streetlight. He wasn't pretending to check his phone or looking away. He was staring directly at my front door. A chill ran down my spine as I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling slightly. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? That some guy followed me in a store, then parked near my house? It wasn't illegal to sit on a public street, and I didn't even know his name. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The bags fell to the floor as I peered through the curtains, trying to convince myself it wasn't him, that it couldn't be, but it was. The faint shape of his face was unmistakable, the same blank expression that had lingered behind me in the store. For hours, the car didn't move. I turned off the lights in the living room, hoping he'd lose interest if he thought I'd gone to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch in the dark, my phone clutched in one hand, watching the faint glow of his headlights through the curtains. Around midnight, the car's engine finally cut out. My stomach tightened as the driver's side door opened. The man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, before walking to the edge of my driveway. I couldn't see his face clearly anymore, just the faint outline of his figure in the moonlight. He stood there for a long time, perfectly still. I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. The operator stayed on the line, asking me to describe the man and his car, but before the police could arrive, he turned and walked back to his vehicle. The sedan started up, its engine humming softly as it drove down the street, disappearing into the night. When the officers arrived, they found no sign of him. They took my statement and assured me they'd patrol the area. But their words felt hollow. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every flicker of shadow against the curtains made my skin crawl. The next morning, I found something on my porch. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, weighted down by a small rock. My chest tightened as I picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sentence, scrawled in faint, uneven handwriting. I know where you live. I installed cameras the same day. Changed the locks, even considered moving, though I never did. The police never found him, and nothing like it ever happened again. But every time I go shopping, every time I walk down an aisle and catch someone standing just a little too close, I think of that man, and I wonder if he's still watching. There's a knock you'll never forget. It comes when the world is quiet, when you think you're alone. That knock came for me last Christmas Eve, and I've been too shaken to talk about it until now. I'm still not sure I should post this, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Or maybe someone can help me make sense of what happened that night. It was around 9 p.m., Christmas Eve. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes outside my window, blanketing my little house at the edge of town. The world was so quiet, it felt muffled, like sound itself was too cold to move. I was curled up on the couch with a mug of hot cocoa, watching It's a Wonderful Life for the 100th time. I live alone, so the holidays can get a little lonely, but I've always liked the peace of it. No family drama, no awkward conversations, just me, my decorations, and the calm of a winter night. That's when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks, loud and urgent, echoed through the house. My hands jerked, spilling cocoa onto my pajama pants. I froze, staring at the door. My nearest neighbors were a half-mile away, and I hadn't ordered anything or invited anyone over. Who would be out in this weather, on this night? I debated ignoring it, but there was something about the knock, something in the way that sound cut through the quiet, that sent a prickle crawling up my spine. I set my mug down, grabbed my phone from the counter, and approached the door. The porch light was on, but the frosted glass made it impossible to see who was outside. "Who is it?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you," a man's voice replied. "My car broke down. I just need to use your phone to call for a tow truck." I hesitated, then peeked through the curtain. A man stood on my porch, hunched against the cold. He was tall and thin, bundled in a heavy coat, scarf, and knit hat. The shadows hid most of his face, but he looked harmless enough. Or, at least, I convinced myself that he did. The Good Samaritan in me won out over my caution. It was Christmas Eve, after all. I cracked the door open, the chain still latched. "I don't usually let strangers in," I said, trying to sound firm. "I understand," he said, smiling faintly. His voice was smooth, polished, almost like a news anchor's, but with no discernible accent. "It's freezing out here. I promise I'll just use the phone and be on my way." Something about his tone made me hesitate. It was too measured, too perfect. But I brushed the thought aside. He looked cold, and I couldn't leave him out there. I closed the door just long enough to undo the chain and let him in. The man stepped into the warmth, brushing snow off his coat. Up close, he was older than I'd thought. Late 40s, maybe? With short graying hair, peeking out from under his hat. His eyes were striking, a piercing blue that seemed to take in everything at once. "Thank you," he said, his breath still visible in the cold air clinging to him. It's a relief to find someone home. This area feels remote. The way he said it made my stomach twist. I nodded, suddenly very aware of how isolated my house was. I handed him my landline. "Go ahead, the phone's yours." He dialed a number. I tried not to eavesdrop, but his conversation was strange. He didn't give a name, a location, or even the make of his car. Just a terse, "I'll need pickup, soon." He hung up and handed the phone back to me with a polite nod. "They'll be here shortly. Mind if I warm up for a few minutes?" "Sure," I said, though I was already regretting letting him in. We sat in awkward silence. The man's eyes wandered around the room, lingering on the Christmas tree, the presents beneath it, the photos on the mantle. I felt like I was being studied, dissected. "Nice decorations," he said finally, his voice calm and smooth. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. "Do you have family around here?" "No," he said simply, locking eyes with me. "Do you?" Something about the question felt deliberate, almost too personal. "Not really," I lied, trying to sound casual. "I usually spend Christmas alone." He nodded, like he already knew. "That's nice. Peaceful." After a few minutes of strained small talk, I stood, hoping to move him along. "Your ride should be here soon," I said. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're very kind to let me in. Most people wouldn't." "It's Christmas," I said, shrugging. Seemed like the right thing to do. His smile widened. That's when I noticed his teeth. Unnaturally white, perfectly straight. "I've been watching your house for a few days now," he said casually. "I thought you might be the kind of person who'd help." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart started pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, forcing a laugh. "That's a weird thing to say." "Is it?" I took a step back, my hands shaking. I think it's time for you to wait outside. Your ride should be here any minute." He didn't move. I don't think they're coming," he said softly. Panic surged through me. "You need to leave. Now." He stood, towering over me. "You shouldn't have let me in. That was your first mistake." I bolted for the door, but he grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and shoved me back toward the couch. "You've been so hospitable," he said, mockery dripping from his tone. "I think I'll stay a while." "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He tilted his head, as if considering the question. "I wanted to meet you. You seem, interesting." His attention slipped just for a moment, and I acted. I lunged for the fireplace poker, swinging it with everything I had. It connected with his shoulder, and he let out a grunt of pain, stumbling back. I didn't wait. I ran for the door, flinging it open and sprinting into the snow. Behind me, his laughter echoed through the night. "You'll never outrun me," he called, his voice carrying over the howling wind. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house. They called the police, who searched my home and the surrounding woods. The man was gone. No car, no footprints, no sign he'd ever been there. The police didn't believe me. No evidence, no forced entry, no broken phone. But I know what I saw. Now, every Christmas Eve, I leave my porch light off. I double-check the locks, triple-check the windows. And sometimes I think I see him, a figure in the woods, watching, waiting. So, Reddit, if a stranger ever knocks on your door on a quiet night, think twice before letting them in. You never know who or what they might be. I've always thought of myself as a careful person. Triple check the locks, let someone know where I'm going, never drive long distances without an emergency kit, that kind of careful. But sometimes, no matter how cautious you are, bad things happen. It was Christmas Eve and I was driving through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. The snow had started earlier than forecasted, and by the time I was halfway to my destination, the world was blanketed in white. The quiet beauty of it was almost enough to make me forget how isolated the area was. Almost. My phone had no service, and the last sign of civilization had been a gas station some 20 miles back. It was Christmas Eve and I was driving through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. The snow had started earlier than forecasted, and by the time I was halfway to my destination, the world was blanketed in white. The quiet beauty of it was almost enough to make me forget how isolated the area was. Almost. My phone had no service, and the last sign of civilization had been a gas station some 20 miles back. Great. Merry Christmas to me. I sat in the driver's seat for a few moments, weighing my options. The snow was falling in thick, relentless sheets. There was no way I'd make it on foot in this weather. I turned the key in the ignition again. Nothing. A quick check of my phone confirmed what I already knew. No signal. I considered grabbing my emergency blanket from the trunk and hunkering down for the night when I spotted headlights in the distance. A faint glow pierced through the storm. Relief surged as the vehicle pulled up behind mine. A rusty old pickup truck, straight out of a country song. The driver's door creaked open, and a tall, thin man stepped out. He wore a heavy coat and a knit cap, with a scarf partially covering his face. His eyes, gray and weathered like a stormy sky, seemed kind. Or so I hoped. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice muffled by the scoff. "Yeah," I said, trying not to sound too desperate. "Won't start, and my phone's dead. No service." He nodded, like he'd expected my situation. "I can take a look, but you'll need to leave your phone in my truck. The cold drains batteries fast in this weather." I hesitated. The request felt strange. Why couldn't I just keep my phone in my pocket? Still, I didn't want to seem rude or overly suspicious. He was trying to help after all. "All right," I said, though reluctantly. I grabbed my phone, climbed out of the car, and followed him to his truck. Inside, it was surprisingly tidy, with an old plaid blanket spread over the bench seat. I placed my phone on the dashboard, as he'd asked. "Perfect. Let's see what's going on," he said, heading back to my car. He popped the hood and started fiddling with the engine, muttering to himself. I stood a few feet away, shivering as the cold seeped through my coat. The wind howled, and snowflakes stung my cheeks like tiny needles. After a few minutes, he straightened up. "Hey, your alternator's shot," he said. "I can tow you to my place. Got a garage there and I can fix you up." "Your place?" I repeated, a wave of unease rising again. "Closest town's 40 miles, he said, almost as if he'd read my mind. "You won't make it in this weather. My place is just a few miles up the road. I've got tools, heat, and coffee. Your call." I glanced at his truck, where my phone sat out of reach. The road was empty, no other cars, no sign of life anywhere. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature was dropping fast. There weren't many options. "Okay," I said after a long pause. "Thanks." He nodded and walked back to his truck to grab a tow chain. As he worked, a nagging thought settled in my mind. I might have just made a terrible mistake. The drive to his place was tense, the only sounds the rattle of the truck and the low hum of the heater. I tried to make small talk, but his replies were short, almost dismissive. Every so often, he glanced at me from the corner of his eye, like he was sizing me up. His scarf had slipped down slightly, revealing lips that were cracked and pale, with a faint bluish tint. The sight sent a knot of unease twisting in my stomach. "Almost there," he said finally, breaking the silence. We turned onto a narrow, snow-covered road, flanked by towering pines. His house came into view, a weathered cabin with a detached garage. It looked ancient, as though it had been forgotten by time. A single, flickering light glowed weakly in the window. He parked the truck and stepped out, motioning for me to follow. The wind hit me hard as I exited, snow stinging my face. He unlocked the garage and flicked on the lights. The space was packed with tools, rusted car parts, and a wood-burning stove. Its flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to shift and writhe against the walls, almost alive. "Wait here," he said, his tone flat. "I'll get the coffee started." With that, he disappeared into the cabin, leaving me alone in the garage. I rubbed my hands together, trying to fight the creeping chill. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, with a sharp metallic tang that made my teeth ache. Something about the place felt off. My pulse quickened, and a deep unease coiled tighter in my gut. I spotted a landline phone on the wall and hurried over to it, hoping to call for help, but when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. Of course, because nothing about this night could possibly go right. The sound of footsteps made me jump. He was back, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "Here," he said, handing me one. I took it, though I had no intention of drinking it. "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded and sipped his coffee, watching me over the rim of his mug. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. "So," I said finally, "do you get a lot of people breaking down out here?" He shrugged. "Now and then." "Must be nice living out here, quiet." He didn't respond, just stared at me with those cold, gray eyes. At one point, I excused myself to the bathroom. Instead of heading to the cabin, I ducked into a small side room in the garage. The air inside was heavier, colder. I flipped on the light and froze. The room was filled with boxes and shelves, crammed with random items, wallets, watches, keys, and phones. Dozens of them, piled in a crate like discarded toys. My stomach turned as I realized what this meant. My hands were trembling, and I had to steady myself against the wall. The metallic tang in the air suddenly seemed sharper, like blood. These weren't just things people had left behind. They were trophies. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. I needed to get out of there, but how? My phone was still in his truck, and I had no idea where the keys were. I turned and nearly screamed. He was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his voice low. I was just looking for the bathroom," I stammered. He stepped closer, blocking the door. "Bathroom's in the cabin. I'll just wait," I said, trying to squeeze past him. He grabbed my arm, his grip cold and unyielding, like steel biting into my skin. "You don't want to go anywhere," he said, his voice cold and flat. "Not in this storm." I don't remember how I got away. It's all a blur of panic and adrenaline. I ran through the snow, my lungs burning, the cold biting at my skin. I didn't stop until I saw headlights in the distance. A snowplow, thank God. The driver called the police, and they found the cabin a few hours later. It was empty. No sign of the man or my car or the boxes I'd seen. Just an abandoned garage in the middle of nowhere. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. The police said it was probably a drifter, someone who moved from place to place, preying on stranded travelers. They never found him. All I know is I'll never drive those back roads again. Some things are better left forgotten, but every time I close my eyes, I see those gray, weathered eyes watching me, waiting for the next storm. I never liked my neighbor Paul. He was loud, pushy, and unbearably cheerful. The kind of man who turned small talk into a full-blown interrogation. And when it came to Christmas, he took too much, to an entirely new level. Every year, starting the day after Thanksgiving, Paul transformed his house into a glowing monument to holiday excess. His display wasn't just festive, it was obnoxious. We're talking blinking reindeer, inflatable Santas, and enough LEDs to blind a small country. It wasn't just the lights. It was the music, a relentless loop of carols blasted from hidden speakers, synchronized with the seizure-inducing light show. Jingle Bell Rock at full volume, day and night. Every year, I cursed him under my breath and wondered how his electric bill didn't bankrupt him. But this year was different. By the second week of December, Paul's house was as over the top as ever. Winter wonderland spilled across the neighborhood like an infectious disease, and kids gathered on the sidewalk to gawk at the display. As usual, I grumbled, slammed my windows shut, and tried to ignore it. But on the night of December 14th, something changed. The lights went out. Not just dimmed, completely extinguished. One moment the house was lit up like a Vegas casino. The next, darkness swallowed it whole. It was so sudden I thought maybe a fuse had blown. I glanced at the clock, 9:17 p.m. For Paul, this was unheard of. His lights usually stayed on until midnight, sometimes later. I peeked out through the blinds. Across the street, Paul's house loomed in eerie silence. No blinking lights, no cheery music, just a shadowy husk of holiday cheer. The faint glow from the street lamp cast long, jagged shadows over his lawn decorations, now lifeless and deflated. The inflatable Santa slumped sideways, its empty head lolling in the breeze. It wasn't my problem. That's what I told myself as I locked the door and climbed into bed. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. I hadn't seen Paul all day, not his wife, Denise, or their 2 kids either. The silence in that house felt too heavy, too deliberate. By 11 p.m., my curiosity got the better of me. I bundled up and crossed the street. As I approached Paul's house, the air seemed to thicken, growing unnaturally still. The neighborhood was quiet at night, but this silence felt different. Oppressive, as if the world were holding its breath. The yard was a wreck. The giant inflatable Santa lay crumpled like a deflated lung, and the reindeer figures were scattered across the lawn, their hollow frames jutting out like broken bones. Tangled strings of Christmas lights twisted in the frost-covered grass, some of them still blinking faintly, like dying fireflies. The front door was ajar. I froze. An open door in the middle of December wasn't just odd, it was wrong. The house beyond the door was dark. No signs of life. I thought about calling the police, but something, maybe stupid curiosity, pushed me forward. "Paul?" I called, stepping onto the porch. My voice felt small in the icy stillness. No answer. I nudged the door open wider. The hinges groaned like an old man waking from a long nap. The faint smell of pine and something else hit me. Sour and rancid. It crawled up my nostrils and settled in my throat. I stepped inside, my boots crunching softly on the doormat. The house felt wrong. You know how some places just feel off, like the air itself is heavier, pressing down on you? That's what it was like. The faint smell of rot grew stronger as I ventured further in. The living room, usually crammed with Paul's tacky decorations, was bare. No tree, no stockings, no garlands. Just empty space lit faintly by the glow of the street lamp outside. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and garbled, like static from a broken radio. It came from deeper in the house. I should have turned around. Any sane person would have turned around. But I didn't. I crept toward the hallway, my pulse thundering in my ears. The whispering grew louder as I approached the kitchen. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, rising and falling in a twisted symphony. They weren't words I could understand, but the tones were unmistakable. Pleading, arguing, mocking. "Paul, Denise," I called again, my voice breaking. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Then, a new sound, the slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard above me. Someone was upstairs. I turned toward the staircase. The banister was wrapped in a string of lights, abandoned and lifeless. The creaking above continued, deliberate and rhythmic, matching my steps as I climbed. The second floor was colder, the air so icy it stung my lungs. A long hallway stretched before me, lined with closed doors. At the end of the hall, one door was slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light seeped through the crack, casting shadows that twisted and danced like flames. I stepped closer, my boots silent on the frigid floor. The whispers returned, louder now. They were coming from that room. I pushed the door open. It was Paul's bedroom, or at least it had been. The bed was gone, the walls stripped bare. In the center of the room loomed a skeletal Christmas tree, its charred branches twisting like claws. Strings of dead lights dangled from its limbs, limp and blackened. Beneath it lay gifts, their wrapping papers soggy and riddled with mold. But it wasn't the tree that made my stomach churn. It was Paul. He was on his knees in front of the tree, his back to me. His hands were raised, trembling as if in prayer. His head twitched violently, like a puppet on fraying strings. His whispers filled the room. "Paul," I choked out. He froze. Slowly, he turned his head, just enough for me to see his face. I wish he hadn't. His eyes were gone, just hollow sockets, dark and wet. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, his teeth jagged and stained red. He whispered a single word, over and over. "Join." The tree's dead, lights flickered to life, casting the room in a sickly green glow. The whispers swelled, 1,000 voices screaming inside my head. I staggered back, clutching my ears. "Join us," Paul crooned, his voice no longer his own. It was guttural and ancient, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The gifts beneath the tree began to move. The wet paper tore as black, spindly hands clawed their way out. The stench of rot was overwhelming. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The house came alive, the walls pulsating like a heartbeat. Shadows slithered across the floor, reaching for me with inky fingers. I bolted down the stairs, my breath hitching in panicked gasps. At the front door, I glanced back. Paul stood at the top of the stairs, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. He smiled, his mouth splitting impossibly wide. "See us soon," he whispered. I ran home and locked every door and window. For the rest of the night, I sat curled in the corner of my living room, waiting for dawn. The police found nothing. No Paul, no Denise, no kids. The house was empty, its lights back on as if nothing had happened. But every night since, I've heard the whispers, faint at first, just outside my window. They're growing louder. And now, I'm afraid they want me to join. I've always been generous around the holidays. I love buying gifts for people, baking cookies for my coworkers, and donating to local toy drives. It's my favorite time of year. But last Christmas, something happened that made me rethink how much I'm willing to give and to whom. It started with a message from an old friend, Jake. We'd been close in college, but had drifted apart over the years. He was the kind of person you keep on social media, but never actually see. Occasionally I'd like his posts, but that was about it. Jake's message came out of nowhere. "Hey, long time no talk. How's life?" It seemed innocent enough. We exchanged a few casual texts, reminiscing about old times. Then he hit me with this. "So, this is awkward, but I was wondering if you could help me out. I'm a little strapped for cash, and I want to get some Christmas gifts for my kids. Could I borrow $500? The request caught me off guard. I didn't even know Jake had kids. I felt for him, but $500 was a lot, especially for someone I hadn't seen in years. I replied carefully. "Hey, I'm sorry to hear you're struggling, but I can't lend that much right now. Maybe try some local charities or gift drives. They can help with stuff like this." His response came almost immediately. "Really? You can't spare anything? I'm desperate here. It's for my kids." Something about his tone rubbed me the wrong way. I'd heard stories of people being scammed like this, and my gut told me to be cautious. "Oh, I wish I could help, but I can't. Sorry, Jake." He didn't reply. I thought that was the end of it. A few days passed, and I was busy with work, juggling meetings and prepping for the holidays. Then, during a late meeting, my phone buzzed. It was Jake. "I really need the money. You don't understand." I didn't reply. Another message followed. "I'm begging you. Don't make me do something I'll regret." My stomach turned. That sounded wrong. I debated blocking him, but decided to leave it alone. Maybe he'd cool down. That evening, as I was heading to my car in the office parking lot, I noticed someone standing near it. Jake. The lot was eerily quiet, lit by dim streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows. Jake looked different from what I remembered. Gaunt and disheveled, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. His eyes had deep, dark hollows beneath them, and he was pacing, muttering under his breath. When he saw me, he stopped and smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," he called out, his voice a little too loud. "Thought I'd stop by since you weren't answering my texts." My heart pounded. I forced a shaky smile. "Jake, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, walking toward me. I took a step back. "You can't just show up at my job. This is crossing a line." He laughed, but it was hollow. "Come on, don't be like that. I just need the money. It's not a big deal to you, right?" "It is a big deal," I said, my voice trembling, "and I already told you I can't help." The smile vanished from his face. "You're lying," he snapped. "I've seen your social media. You just went on vacation. You can afford it." My blood ran cold. "Jake, you need to leave. I said, backing toward the office doors. I'm serious. He stepped closer, his face contorting with anger. After everything we've been through, you're gonna turn your back on me? You owe me. I don't owe you anything, I said, my fear boiling into anger. That seemed to set him off. He lunged, grabbing my arm in a bruising grip. His breath was hot on my face as he hissed. You're gonna regret this. You think you're better than me? You think you can just ignore me? I yanked free and bolted back into the building, slamming the door behind me. Security escorted Jake off the property, and I filed a report with HR. They suggested I contact the police, but part of me didn't want to believe he was an actual threat. Maybe he was just desperate. That night, I blocked his number and all his social media accounts. I hoped that would be the end of it. A few days later, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a single piece of paper with the words, "You'll pay one way or another." I called the police. They filed a report and promised to patrol the area, but without proof that Jake had left the note, there wasn't much they could do. For the next week, I barely slept. Every creak, every shadow outside my window made me jump. I kept every light in the house on. One night, just past midnight, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing. The porch was empty. But when I opened the door, a small package sat on the doorstep. I brought it inside with shaking hands. The paper was hastily wrapped, the tape uneven. Inside was a Christmas card, scrawled in messy, frantic handwriting. "You should have just helped me. Merry Christmas." Beneath the card was a single item, a photograph of me, taken through my living room window. The blinds had been closed. I left town that night, staying with a friend for the rest of the holiday season. I haven't been back to my house since. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Jake disappeared not long after. No one knows where he went or what happened to him. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his words echo in my mind. "You'll pay, one way or another." I wonder if this is really over, or if he's still out there, watching, waiting. Be careful who you let in. Some people will take everything you have and still demand more. I moved into my new house last November, just in time for the holidays. It's a cozy little place in a quiet neighborhood with big windows overlooking the yard. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start. This house felt like a blank slate, a quiet, simple place to rebuild after a tough couple of years. The first snowfall came in early December. I spent the morning shoveling the driveway and tossing salt on the steps, humming Christmas songs to myself. Everything felt peaceful and idyllic, the way winter mornings are supposed to feel. But that night, I noticed something odd. As I was locking up before bed, I glanced out the living room window and saw a snowman in the middle of the yard. It wasn't huge, maybe 4 feet tall, but it was well made, with 3 perfectly stacked snowballs, stick arms, and a carrot nose. I hadn't built it. I shrugged it off, figuring one of the neighbor kids had done it. It seemed harmless enough, and honestly, it made the yard look festive. The next morning, the snowman was still there, but something about it seemed different. It was closer. And not by much, but instead of being in the middle of the yard, it was now a few feet closer to the house. I stepped outside to investigate. The snow around the base was undisturbed, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to indicate how it had been moved. I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe I'd misjudged the distance the night before. But that night, there was another snowman. This one was a little taller with longer stick arms and what looked like stones for eyes. It stood next to the first one, both of them now about 10 feet from the house. Again, no tracks in the snow. I tried not to think about it. The next night, there was a third snowman. This one was even closer, right at the edge of the porch. Its face was different too. The stones were arranged into a twisted grin that made my stomach churn. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the lights off, peering through the blinds at the snowmen. They stood there, silent and still, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. At around 3 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps, crunching softly in the snow, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I scanned the yard, but I didn't see anyone. The snowmen stood exactly where they'd been all evening. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally mustering the courage to open the door. The yard was empty. I stepped onto the porch, shivering in the freezing air. The snow was untouched. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I saw it. A handprint. It was pressed against the living room window, large and smeared, as if someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. I bolted back inside and locked every door and window. The next morning, the snowmen were gone. All 3 of them. The yard was pristine, like they'd never been there. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Maybe it was over. Maybe whoever or whatever was behind this had moved on. But that night, I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't stop at the yard. They came up the porch steps. My heart raced as I listened to the soft creak of the wood, followed by a light tap on the window. I didn't dare move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the glass. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and whipped open the curtains. There was nothing there. But when I opened the door, I saw it. A single snowman, taller than any of the others, standing in the middle of the porch. Its stick arms were raised like it was reaching for the door. The stones in its face were arranged into an impossibly wide grin, and in one of its stick hands, it held a piece of paper. I snatched the paper and slammed the door shut. Scrawled in shaky, uneven letters were 3 words. Let me in? I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I went outside with a baseball bat, ready to smash the snowman to bits. But it was gone. No tracks, no melted snow, just an empty porch. I called the police, but they didn't take me seriously. Snowmen in your yard? Ma'am, it's probably just kids messing around. Then where are the footprints? I snapped, but the officer only sighed. It's snow. It covers things up. Relax. He didn't call back. So I installed cameras, motion-activated ones, and waited. The cameras didn't catch much at first, just shifting shadows in the occasional passing car. But on the 4th night, the motion sensor went off at 2:37 a.m. I watched the footage the next morning, my stomach in knots. The video showed the yard empty and still until a faint, human-shaped shadow appeared at the edge of the frame. The shadow moved to the center of the yard, crouched down, and began to form the base of a snowman. But here's the thing, the snow never moved. The shadow's hands shaped the air, and yet the snowman grew, piece by piece, as if being built out of nothing. The snowman was finished in minutes. Then the shadow turned toward the camera. Its face was indistinct, featureless, but it knew I was watching. Then the video ended. I left the house the next day, packed a bag and drove to a hotel. I haven't been back since. The cameras are still set up, but I refuse to check the footage. As I closed the hotel curtains tonight, I froze. Across the parking lot, standing in the icy grass, was a single snowman. Its stick arms were raised, its grin impossibly wide. In one of its hands, it held a piece of paper. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. I'm not a collector. I don't know much about toys or memorabilia, but I know a good deal when I see one. That's how this nightmare began. A chance encounter at a garage sale and a seemingly harmless purchase. It was early December, and I stopped by a local garage sale on my way home. The setup was modest. A couple of folding tables piled with knickknacks, holiday decorations, and old toys. A small hand-painted sign read, "Everything must go." I was about to leave and I saw it, a vintage Cabbage Patch Kids doll, still in its original box. I'm no expert, but I know these dolls can be valuable. My older sister had one growing up, and I remember how obsessed she was with it. This one looked different though, older, with a unique outfit and a slightly offbeat design. The box was faded but intact, and the doll itself looked untouched, as if time hadn't touched it. I picked it up and asked the seller, an elderly man with hunched shoulders and watery eyes, how much for this? He stared at the doll for a long moment before answering. That one? $20. It seemed like a steal. Even if it wasn't worth much, I could resell it or give it as a quirky gift. But as I reached for my wallet, I noticed his fingers tightening around the box. "Are you sure you want this?" he asked, his voice low and uneven. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, why wouldn't I?" He hesitated, his lips trembling like he was searching for the right words. Finally, he sighed. "Just be careful. Some things aren't meant to leave." I shrugged it off, chalking it up to sentimental attachment, a man reluctant to part with his belongings. I handed him the cash, and he let go of the box with a strange reluctance, as if it physically hurt him. When I got home, I placed the doll on a shelf in my living room, next to an old lamp. Its glassy eyes caught the light in an oddly lifelike way, and its crooked smile seemed to widen as I set it down. I shook my head and laughed at myself. It was just a doll. That night, I decided to do a little research. The doll was part of a rare limited run from the early 1980s. It had a unique outfit, a small denim jacket and overalls that weren't part of the standard Cabbage Patch line. But what really caught my attention was an article about a recall. Parents have reported disturbing issues, dolls that moved their limbs on their own, whispered strange sounds, or disappeared and reappeared in other rooms. Some claimed the dolls were cursed. I rolled my eyes. Every collectible has urban legends like this. What interested me more was the value. One of these dolls had sold at auction for over $2,000. I went to bed that night feeling like I'd hit the jackpot. The first incident was small. The next morning, I noticed the doll's head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it had shifted overnight. Its tiny cloth arms were stretched forward, almost like it was reaching for something. I figured I'd bump the shelf without realizing it. But the next night, I woke to a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the radiator, but the sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the living room. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed and flipped on the lights. The doll was on the floor, lying face up in the middle of the room. I told myself it must have fallen, though the shelf was steady and nothing else had been disturbed. Still, unease prickled at the back of my neck. A few days later, I came home from work to find my front door ajar. I froze. I was certain I'd locked it. Inside, everything looked normal, no signs of a break-in, but when I checked the shelf, the doll was gone. I tore the apartment apart searching for it, panic bubbling in my chest. I was sure I hadn't moved it. Finally, I walked into the bathroom and froze. There, taped to the mirror, was a note, written in shaky black letters. "It belongs to me." I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. I called the police. They searched the apartment but found no sign of forced entry. Nothing else was missing. They suggested I change my locks, but the way they looked at me, the polite skepticism in their eyes, made me feel like I was losing my mind. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment felt like a warning. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the faint tapping sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from the hallway, outside my bedroom. Clutching my phone, I crept toward the noise. My hands trembled as I turned the corner. And that's when I saw him. The old man from the garage sale. He was standing in the hallway, cradling the doll in his arms. His face was pale and gaunt, his watery eyes hollow with something that looked like desperation or hunger. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to leave. It's mine. It'll always be mine." I backed away, my voice shaking. "How the hell did you get in here?" He didn't answer. His fingers tightened around the doll as he took a step closer. "Take it," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Take the damn thing and get out." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he turned and bolted toward the front door, moving with an unnatural speed. When the police came again, they found no sign of the man. They said they'd investigate, but I could tell they thought I was imagining things. I wasn't. The doll's gone now, so is the old man. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. And every so often I find another note slipped under my door, always the same message. "It belongs to me." I sold everything I could and moved across the country, but no matter how far I run, it doesn't stop. It's watching, waiting. And when I hear that faint tapping, I know it's only a matter of time. I used to love Christmas markets. The lights, the music, the smell of roasted chestnuts. It all felt magical. But now, every time I think about that night, I feel sick. If I'd known how quickly good intentions could turn into a nightmare, I'd have stayed far away. It happened last December, when a new Christmas market opened in the city square, and I was eager to check it out. I've always loved the festive atmosphere, wandering through the stalls, sipping hot chocolate, and basking in the glow of twinkling lights. That night, the market was packed, shoulder to shoulder in the cold winter air. I didn't mind the crowd. Being part of the hustle and bustle added to the charm. But I didn't know that same crowd would soon turn on me. It started when I noticed her. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, near the carousel. She wore a bright pink coat and hat, her tiny frame swallowed by the sea of people. At first, she seemed like any other child enjoying the market, but her face told another story. She looked terrified, her wide eyes darting from stranger to stranger as she clutched her hands together. My heart ached seeing her trembling. It was clear she was lost. I hesitated, assuming her parents were nearby. Then her lips quivered as she whispered, "I can't find my mommy." That settled it. Kneeling, I smiled despite my growing worry. "Hey, it's okay. I'll help you find her. What's your name?" "Lila," she replied, barely audible. I gently asked where she last saw her mom, and she pointed toward the food stalls. I offered my hand, reassuring her, "Let's go look for her together." Her small, cold fingers clasped mine as we weaved through the crowd. I scanned every face, hoping to spot someone frantic and calling out for a child. Although I tried to stay composed for Lila's sake, unease crept in with every passing moment. "Do you know your mom's phone number?" I asked. She shook her head, staring at the ground. "No problem," I said, injecting confidence into my voice. "We'll find her. I promise." I aimed for the information booth, hoping someone there could help. But before we could reach it, a sharp tug on my arm stopped me. Behind me stood a scruffy man, his red face twisted with anger. "What are you doing with that kid?" he demanded. Shocked, I stammered, "She's lost. I'm helping her find her mom." Before I could explain further, a suspicious woman joined him. "That doesn't look like your kid. What's going on here?" Panic bubbled up as I tried to clarify, but their accusations escalated. "Someone call security," the man shouted. The murmurs around us swelled, and a small crowd began to gather, their judgmental stares piercing. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding," I pleaded, but my words only fanned the flames. "You're trying to kidnap her," the woman accused. My heart pounded as I desperately tried to defend myself. A security guard arrived, stern and unyielding. "Step away from the child," he ordered. I pleaded, explaining that I was helping her find her parents. Lila, now sobbing, confirmed my story, but her words were drowned out by the crowd's hostility. Another guard led her away, and I was left feeling abandoned and misunderstood. Taken to a small office, I endured everything for Lila, her cries of help, and the crowd's sudden accusations. Despite proving my innocence with ID and phone records, the experience was harrowing. Eventually, the police confirmed Lila's parents had been found, and I was free to leave. But the officer's parting words, "Next time, let security handle it," left me hollow. Yeah. Walking out of the market, the once magical lights and music felt distant, tainted by what had happened. The memory of the crowd's faces, their anger, suspicion, and judgment haunted me. In their eyes, I was a monster, not a good Samaritan. The weight of their condemnation crushed me, leaving me questioning everything. Maybe I should have let security handle it, but what if I had? Would Lila have found her parents as quickly? I'll never know. What I do know is this: I'll never step foot in a Christmas market again. Sometimes, no matter how good your intentions, the world twists them into something ugly. That night shattered my trust in both people and the magic of the season. It still doesn't feel real, like some twisted Black Mirror episode I can't wake up from. But this isn't fiction. This is a warning. And a confession. It all started last December at my office, where I work at a mid-sized marketing firm. The atmosphere is friendly but professional, the kind of place where people get along without getting too personal. Every year, HR organizes a Secret Santa gift exchange, and while I've never been a fan, I participate out of obligation. This year was no different. I drew Monica from accounting and bought her a cheesy coffee mug with a cat pun. Perfectly balanced accounts. I didn't expect anything special in return. When it was my turn to open my gift, I braced for the usual Starbucks gift card or cheap chocolates. Instead, I unwrapped a sleek, high-end pair of noise-canceling headphones worth hundreds of dollars. My coworkers reacted with surprise and envy, but I felt uneasy. Such an expensive gift was out of place for our modest office tradition. The box had no tag, and no one admitted to being my secret Santa. Monica gave me a knowing smile that lingered uncomfortably long, though she didn't say anything. I tried convincing myself it was just a generous gesture, but the unease gnawed at me. Then, the strange occurrences began. At first, the signs were subtle. A shadow flitting near the parking lot entrance as I left work. My apartment door mysteriously unlocked when I was sure I'd locked it. I dismissed these as coincidences, though a creeping unease followed me. The turning point came about a week after the gift exchange, while I was using the headphones. A faint clicking sound, like static, caught my attention. Inspecting the headphones closely, I discovered an odd seam at the base of one ear cup. With a screwdriver, I pried it open and froze in shock. Nestled inside was a small device with a blinking light, a GPS tracker. My hands trembled as I stared at it, horrified. Someone had been tracking me. Panic gripped me, but curiosity held me back from destroying it. I needed answers. The next day, I carried on at work, feigning normalcy while paranoia churned inside me. Everyone seemed suspicious. Monica avoided eye contact, and Susan from HR glanced at the headphones on my desk. By lunch, I couldn't take it anymore. I marched into HR, showed Susan the tracker, and explained everything. Her expression shifted from disbelief to alarm. She called security, who combed through the office cameras and promised to investigate, but I could tell they didn't expect to find much. That night, paranoia consumed me. Every creak in my apartment sounded ominous. Every shadow seemed alive. Then, at midnight, my phone buzzed with a text. "Why'd you ruin the surprise?" The message sent chills down my spine. My trembling hands replied, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "You shouldn't have gone to HR." Fear surged as I realized someone was watching me. Calling the police yielded no help. They said there wasn't enough evidence of a crime. Determined to fight back, I reinserted the tracker into the headphones and left them on my desk by the window, hoping to lure whoever was behind this. Around 9 p.m., headlights swept through the parking lot. A man in a dark hoodie emerged, moving cautiously toward my building. Heart racing, I called the police and described what I saw. While I waited for them to arrive, the man reached my door and slid something under it. He stood there, motionless, as if he could see through the door, before turning and leaving. When the police arrived, they found no sign of him, but the note he left behind chilled me to the core. Scrawled in block letters, it read, "You should have just warned them." The next day, I quit my job and began the process of moving out of my apartment. The police never uncovered who was responsible or why, and HR claimed they couldn't determine who gifted me the headphones. Whoever it was, they knew too much about me, where I lived, where I worked, and they wanted me to feel their presence. Now, in a new city, I struggle to rebuild my sense of safety. Every unexpected gift or lingering glance feels like a potential threat. To anyone reading this, if you ever receive a gift that seems too extravagant, don't accept it blindly. Sometimes the true danger isn't the gift itself, it's what comes afterward. Christmas shopping is always chaotic, but it's one of my favorite parts of the holidays. Picking out gifts for the people I love, imagining the smiles on their faces as they open them, it makes the season feel magical. This year, though, It felt different. Wrong. It started with a man. The first time I noticed him, I was at a department store browsing for winter coats. I was debating between two options, trying to imagine which my mom would like better, when I caught sight of him out of the corner of my eye. He was standing a few feet away, looking at the same rack. Nothing about him stood out at first, just an average man in his 40s, with a worn gray coat and dark unkempt hair. He wasn't even doing anything unusual, just running his fingers across the coats like he was shopping too. I didn't think much of it. It's the holidays. Stores are crowded, people bump into each other. End of story. I picked a coat, paid, and moved on to my next stop. That's when I saw him again. I was in a toy store across the mall, searching for something for my niece. I had just picked up a doll with long blonde hair and was reading the box when I glanced up and saw him standing near the entrance. He wasn't looking at toys or anything else in the store, just me. My first thought was that it was a coincidence. Maybe he was shopping for someone too, but he wasn't carrying any bags. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, hands stuffed into his coat pockets, watching. I put the doll down and hurried out of the store, telling myself I was imagining things. It was the holidays after all. Crowds make everything feel chaotic. But as I walked toward my next stop, I caught a glimpse of him again, this time reflected in a shop window. He was a few paces behind me, just far enough to blend into the crowd, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. By the time I reached the bookstore, my hands were shaking. I darted inside, weaving through the aisles, pretending to browse. My heart thudded as I kept an eye on the entrance. A few minutes passed. Then he appeared, stepping through the door like he'd been invited. He didn't look at the books. He didn't even glance around. He just stood there near the entrance, his eyes following me. I'd had enough. I forced myself to walk toward him, though every instinct told me to run. My voice trembled as I said, "Can I help you? Why are you following me?" He tilted his head slightly, as if the question surprised him. Then he smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made my skin crawl. "I just want to see what you're buying for your family," he said. Something about the way he said it, so calm, like it was perfectly normal, made my stomach twist. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and walked out of the store as fast as I could, weaving through the crowd until I reached the parking lot. I decided to leave the mall entirely. There was a strip of smaller stores across town where I could finish my shopping. I figured if I got far enough away, he wouldn't follow me. But when I pulled into the parking lot of the first store, my breath caught in my throat. He was already there. He stood by the entrance, his gray coat blending into the shadows of the building, his face expressionless now, like he'd been waiting for me. I didn't even get out of my car. I drove to another store, and another. It didn't matter where I went. He was always there, always standing just far enough away to avoid confrontation. He never carried anything, never pretended to shop. He was just there. By the time I reached my last stop, a small toy store on the edge of town, I was too exhausted and scared to care anymore. I grabbed the first gift I saw that seemed remotely appropriate. A doll, like the one I'd seen earlier, and headed to the register. That's when I saw him again, standing by a display of dolls. He was holding one. It was the exact doll I'd picked up earlier that day but decided not to buy. I couldn't take it anymore. My voice cracked as I marched up to him. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer right away. He stared down at the doll in his hands, running his fingers across the plastic packaging like he was lost in thought. Then, slowly, he looked at me. "I just think it's nice to know how much people care about their families," he said. His tone was calm, almost wistful, but there was something mocking beneath it that made my stomach churn. He took a step closer, and I stumbled back. "Sometimes," he continued, "people forget what really matters." I didn't wait to hear anything else. I dropped the toy I was holding and bolted out of the store. I drove home, checking my mirrors the entire way. When I got inside, I locked every door and window and called my best friend. She told me to call the police, but what would I even say? A man had followed me, stood near me, said something strange. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't done anything illegal. That night, I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past my bedroom window. But when I worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found a bag on my doorstep. Inside were the items I'd thought about buying while I was shopping but didn't. The exact coat I'd picked out for my mom. The doll from the toy store. A book I'd looked at in the bookstore but put back. On top of everything was a note, written in neat, blocky handwriting. Don't forget what matters most. I called the police. They took the bag and the note as evidence, but told me there wasn't much they could do. No cameras had caught anything, and there was no proof the man I'd described was involved. Since then, every Christmas, I've received a package with no return address. Sometimes it's a random trinket. Sometimes it's a gift I've bought for my family but hadn't told anyone about. Last year, it was a framed photo of my family. It was taken from inside my house. I don't know who he is or why he chose me, but every year, I'm reminded that someone out there is watching me, waiting to remind me of what matters most, whether I want to be reminded or not. Christmas Eve is supposed to be warm and cheerful. It's a time for cozy fires, hot cocoa, and lights glittering against freshly fallen snow. For us, it used to be that way. This year, Christmas Eve gave me something else entirely. Something I can't explain. Something I'll never forget. It started around 8 p.m. when the whole neighborhood lost power. At first, I thought it was just our house. But when I stepped outside, I saw nothing but darkness stretching down our street. The only light came from the heavy clouds above, glowing faintly against the snow. I wasn't too worried at first. Winter blackouts aren't uncommon around here. My wife and I had prepared for moments like this. The generator we installed a few years ago sat behind the house, ready to kick in when the grid failed. "I'll check the generator," I said, grabbing my flashlight. "Stay inside. Keep warm." My wife nodded, scooping our youngest off the couch, while our older son, his face still lit with the excitement of Christmas Eve, went to help light some candles. I bundled up, pulling on my thick coat and boots, and stepped outside into the icy night. The air was unnervingly still. No hum of Christmas music from the neighbors, no distant laughter, just the crunch of my boots on snow. The flashlight beam jittered across the ground as I made my way to the corner of the house. And that's when I saw it. Someone was crouched behind the generator. For a split second, I thought it might be a neighbor trying to help. Maybe their own generator had failed and they'd come to see if mine was working. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure didn't move like a person. Their motions were slow, deliberate, mechanical, almost. They were hunched over, wire cutters glinting in their hand as they snipped through the cables connecting the generator to the house. "Hey!" I shouted, the sound sharp in the cold air. The figure froze, their hand paused mid-snip. Slowly, they turned their head toward me, and my flashlight landed on their mask. It was crude. Strips of cloth tied haphazardly, with jagged holes where the eyes should have been. Behind the mask, I could just barely make out their skin, pale and frostbitten. Their breathing was audible now, rasping and shallow, like they were struggling to draw air through the cold. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted again, though my voice cracked on the last word. The figure tilted their head slightly, as if confused. then rose to their full height. They were taller than I'd expected, too tall. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and the wire cutters dangled loosely from their fingers. I expected them to run, or apologize, or even attack, but they didn't do any of those things. Instead, they just turned. No rush, no panic. They walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the flashlight beam. I stood there for a long time, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers hurt, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the faint crunch of their footsteps as they faded into the night. Back inside, I locked every door and window. My wife asked what had happened. Someone was messing with the generator, I said. They're gone now. I didn't tell her about the mask or how the figure had stared at me without saying a word. I didn't want to scare her or the kids. I managed to get the generator working again, though I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Something about the way they moved wasn't right. They weren't dressed for the cold. No coat, no gloves, just that awful mask and bare, dirty hands. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone tried to cut my generator wires and walked away? It didn't seem like enough to justify a call. Around midnight, the noises started. At first, it was subtle, scraping near the windows, faint tapping on the walls. I told myself it was just the wind, or tree branches brushing against the house. But then I heard the crunch of snow outside, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I crept to the living room window and peeked out, careful not to let my flashlight beam betray me. At first, I didn't see anything, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed shapes moving in the yard. There were 3 of them now. They wore the same masks, the same tattered clothes. One was crouched near the generator again, while the other 2 stood motionless, facing the house, just staring. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Backing away from the window, I told my wife to take the kids upstairs and lock the door. She didn't argue. I could see the fear in her eyes as she rushed them upstairs, whispering hurried reassurances I didn't believe. I grabbed the fireplace poker and sat near the front door, heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Scraping gave way to heavy banging, like fists hitting the walls. And then came the whispers. They were faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. They didn't sound like words, more like static, garbled, wet, and wrong. And they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the house. I checked every room, every closet, every corner where someone might hide. Nothing. But when I went to the basement, my flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Bare, human footprints. Pressed into the thin layer of dust on the basement floor. They led to the air vent near the ceiling. The vent cover hung loose, held in place by just one screw. The power didn't come back until morning. By then, the figures were gone, leaving nothing behind but a few scuffed tracks in the snow. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun rose, I called the police. They searched the house, the yard, the basement, nothing. No signs of a break-in, no evidence of tampering. They chalked it up to stress, maybe even a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I know what I saw. A few weeks later, when the snow began to melt, one of my neighbors found something strange buried near their generator. It was a mask. Just like the ones I'd seen, it was smeared with dried blood, and inside were teeth, human teeth. I don't live in that house anymore. I moved my family across the country, as far away as we could get. But every Christmas Eve, no matter where I am, I hear faint tapping on the walls, and I wonder if they've found me again. Every year, my family gathers for Christmas. 20 of us, grandparents, cousins, uncles, aunts, and kids, all crammed together under one roof. It's chaotic, loud, and wonderful. This year, Uncle Jim outdid himself by renting a mansion in the mountains. It was remote, luxurious, and covered in a blanket of fresh snow. The house was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest, multiple fireplaces, and more bedrooms than we needed. It felt too good to be true. I didn't realize how wrong that feeling would turn out to be. The first night was perfect. We made a huge dinner, played board games, and opened a few early gifts. The kids went to bed around 10, and the adults stayed up drinking by the fire. The only unsettling thing was the silence outside. You don't realize how loud the suburbs are. Cars, neighbors, pets, until you're somewhere that quiet. The snow muffled everything, and the house felt isolated, cut off from the world. We went to bed around 1 a.m., full and happy. That's when everything started. I was the first to hear it. 3 loud knocks on the front door. I was half asleep, but the sound yanked me awake instantly. My room was on the 2nd floor, and I strained to hear voices, footsteps, anything. But there was nothing. Then the knocks came again, harder this time. I crept out of my room and found Uncle Jim already heading downstairs with a flashlight. "Stay up here," he whispered to me. But of course, I followed. Curiosity won out over fear. When Jim opened the door, no one was there. Fresh snow covered the driveway and steps, untouched. He swung the flashlight around, illuminating the trees beyond the property, but saw nothing. "Probably kids messing around, huh?" he muttered, locking the door and bolting it shut. We went back upstairs, but I couldn't sleep. Something about the way the knocking sounded, so deliberate, so heavy, made my skin crawl. The next morning, we woke up to find something strange. A small wooden figure, a crude doll carved out of sticks, was sitting on the porch. It wasn't there the night before. Uncle Jim brushed it off as someone's idea of a prank. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said. "Locals probably like to mess with tourists." But the rest of us weren't so sure. That evening, things escalated. The storm that had been brewing all day finally hit, and the power went out just as we were cleaning up dinner. Uncle Jim went to the garage to start the backup generator, but after a few minutes, he came back pale and shaking. "The wires are cut," he said. His voice was flat, but I could see the panic in his eyes. "Someone did this on purpose." That's when the first window shattered. It came from the kitchen. We all rushed over, but no one was there, just glass everywhere and the icy wind blowing in. Uncle Jim and a couple of my cousins grabbed knives and started searching the house, room by room. The rest of us huddled in the living room, trying to keep the kids calm. Then we saw them. Through the massive windows overlooking the forest, we saw figures. 3, maybe 4 people, all wearing masks. They weren't moving, just standing in the snow, staring at the house. We froze. I don't know how long we sat there, whispering and panicking, before Uncle Jim came back. He looked out the window and swore under his breath. "Stay here," he ordered, but we begged him not to go outside. Whoever they were, they didn't leave. For hours, they just stood there, unmoving, even as the storm picked up. We tried calling the police, but there was no signal. We had no way of knowing if they were armed, if they wanted to break in, or if they were just trying to scare us. Then they started knocking again. This time, the knocking came from every door and window, like they were everywhere at once. It wasn't frantic or rushed. It was slow, deliberate, and in unison. The sound echoed through the house, and the kids started crying. Uncle Jim and a few others decided to barricade the doors and windows as best they could. They moved furniture in front of the main entrance and nailed some of the bedroom doors shut. Meanwhile, the rest of us stayed together in the living room, clutching anything that could be used as a weapon. The worst part was the silence between knocks. Minutes would pass where nothing happened, and then bang! A single knock, loud and jarring. It felt like they were toying with us, drawing it out. Around midnight, one of the masked figures finally moved. They walked right up to the living room window and pressed their face against the glass. The mask was featureless, just a blank white surface, but the way they tilted their head, like they were curious, made my stomach drop. Then, without warning, the glass shattered. The figure reached inside, clawing at the broken shards. Uncle Jim and my cousin lunged at them, slashing with knives and yelling, and the person pulled back. We heard their footsteps crunching through the snow as they retreated into the forest. That's when we realized they weren't working alone. We heard a scream from upstairs. Uncle Jim bolted toward the sound, with a few of us trailing behind. One of my younger cousins, Ellie, had been hiding in a bedroom when someone broke through the window. She was unharmed, but hysterical, pointing at the smashed glass. "He was in here," she sobbed. "He was in here." We swept the room, but whoever had broken in was gone. The window was wide open, snow piling on the floor. Outside, more figures were gathering. There were at least 6 of them now, all in masks, standing motionless in the snow. The rest of the night was a blur. The intruders kept circling the house, breaking windows, rattling doors, and scraping metal objects against the walls. At one point, they managed to pry open the garage door. Uncle Jim and the others barricaded it with a dresser, but it was clear they were testing our defenses, looking for a way in. The final, most terrifying moment came just before dawn. The knocking stopped, the voices quieted, and the figures disappeared into the trees. For the first time all night, the house was silent. Then, written on the living room window in what looked like ash or charcoal, we saw the words, "Not tonight." We left as soon as the roads were clear. The police didn't take us seriously when we explained what had happened. "Mountain kids messing around," they said. I know the truth. This wasn't a prank. Whoever those people were, they were organized, calculated, and cruel. And the worst part? As we were unpacking at home a few days later, I found something stuffed into my bag. A small wooden doll, just like the one we found on the porch. It all started as a dumb joke, the kind of thing teenagers do when they're bored out of their minds and looking for cheap thrills. I'll admit, I was all in on it at first. It was Christmas Eve, and the 4 of us, me, my best friend Lucas, his girlfriend Tasha, and my little brother Andy, were feeling restless. My parents were hosting their annual Christmas party, which meant the house was packed with relatives we didn't care to hang out with. "We could go to the movies," I suggested. "Lame," Lucas said, scrolling through his phone like it might provide divine inspiration. "It's Christmas Eve, man. We gotta do something memorable." That's when Tasha looked up, her dark eyes glinting mischievously. "Ding dong ditch," Lucas grinned, immediately on board. "Yes, let's do it." Andy, only 13 and constantly desperate to seem cool, practically begged to tag along. I wasn't so sure. It felt childish, like something we would have done in middle school. But Lucas and Tasha had a way of making dumb ideas sound fun. The thought of running through snow-covered yards, giggling like idiots in Santa hats, had its appeal. Harmless fun, right? If I'd known how the night would end, I would have locked every door, thrown Lucas out of the house, and hidden under my bed until morning. We piled into Lucas's beat-up sedan, blasting Christmas music, ironically, as we headed for the ritziest neighborhood in town. The houses were enormous, decked out in elaborate lights, and glowing decorations. Reindeer pranced across manicured lawns, inflatable Santas waved from porches, and one house even had a full nativity scene in the yard. It was like driving through a Hallmark card. The first few houses were easy. Lucas and Tasha would run up to the doors, ring the bell, slap a candy cane on the mat, and sprint back to the car. Andy and I stayed behind, laughing at the confused homeowners who peeked out a few seconds too late. It was stupid, but it was the kind of stupid that made you forget everything else for a little while. Then Lucas got bored. "Let's hit the cabin," he said suddenly, spinning the steering wheel toward the outskirts of town. I froze. Everyone knew about the cabin. It wasn't really a cabin, just an old house, rotting away at the edge of the woods. The kind of place people whispered about but avoided. The story was always the same. The family who lived there disappeared without a trace, and anyone who knocked on the door was cursed to disappear too. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Why not?" Tasha said, bouncing with excitement. "It's perfect. Let's scare the crap out of ourselves." Andy tugged on my sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "Do we have to? I don't like this." I should have said no. I should have told Lucas to drive us home, but I didn't. I told myself it was just a house, just a stupid story. I didn't want to look like a coward in front of Lucas and Tasha. "We'll do it quick," I said, swallowing hard. "One ring, and we're out." The driveway to the cabin was long and narrow, a tunnel of snow-covered trees that pressed close on either side. The headlights barely cut through the thick darkness ahead, and the tires crunched loudly over the frozen ground. When we reached the end, the house loomed before us, more terrifying than I'd imagined. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt alive, in the worst way. The windows gaped like hollow eyes. The shutters hung crookedly, and the porch sagged like it might collapse under a single step. A single flickering porch light cast eerie shadows across the warped wood. "Okay, quick in and out," I said, my voice trembling. Lucas and Tasha climbed out first, each grabbing a candy cane. They darted toward the porch, their laughter unnervingly loud in the stillness. Andy and I stayed behind, watching nervously. Lucas rang the bell, slapped the candy cane on the mat, and sprinted back to the car. We waited, holding our breath. No one came to the door. "That's lame," Tasha said, hopping out of the car again. "Tasha, don't," I started, but she was already halfway to the porch. She rang the bell and knocked loudly, leaning down to place another candy cane. The porch light flickered once and went out. Tasha froze. So did we. The house stood in complete darkness, a looming shadow against the snow. Then, movement. In one of the upstairs windows, a figure appeared, just barely visible in the moonlight. It stood perfectly stopped, watching. "Tasha, get in the car," I hissed. She turned to run, but just as she reached the car, the front door creaked open. It swung slowly, revealing nothing but blackness inside. "Go, go, go!" Lucas yelled, and I slammed on the gas. The tires skidded on the icy driveway before finally gripping, and we sped away, hearts pounding. We didn't stop laughing until we were back on the main road. Nervous, jittery laughter that didn't quite feel right. "Did you see that?" Lucas asked. "There was someone in there." "No way," Tasha said, but her voice cracked slightly. Andy was shaking beside me. "We shouldn't have gone, I told you." I didn't argue. Something about the way that door opened, so slow, so deliberate, made my skin crawl. As we pulled into Lucas's driveway to drop him and Tash off, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A candy cane sat on the hood of the car. We hadn't gotten out since leaving the cabin. "Did one of you put that there?" Lucas asked. "No," I said firmly. Andy started crying. "We have to go home. Please, let's go home." We didn't argue. Lucas and Tasha bolted inside, and I sped off toward our house. Halfway there, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another car, but the truck sped up, tailgating us so closely I thought it would hit us. The horn blared, a low, distorted sound that made my teeth ache. Andy screamed as the truck swerved into the other lane and pulled up beside us. I glanced over and nearly lost control of the car. The driver was wearing a mask. An old, cracked Santa face with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched too wide. He jerked the truck toward us, forcing me to swerve onto a side street. The truck didn't follow. But when we turned onto our street, it was waiting for us. The truck was parked in front of our house, its engine rumbling. The driver stood on the lawn, holding something in his hand, a dirty, oversized sack. I didn't stop. I drove past the house and into a nearby parking lot, my hands trembling on the wheel. "We call the police," I said, fumbling for my phone. The line crackled with static. "No, no, no," I muttered, trying again. This time, the call went through, but no one answered. When we finally returned home, the truck was gone, but the front door was wide open. Inside, the house was trashed, furniture overturned, decorations smashed. Candy canes were scattered everywhere, forming a trail that led to the living room. In the center of the room was the sack. I untied it with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of crumpled pieces of paper, each with the same message written in jagged red letters. "You shouldn't have knocked." Snow piled high against the windows of Grandma's house as the family gathered inside for Christmas. The adults were in the dining room, caught up in wine-fueled conversations and laughter that echoed through the house, drowning out the crackling fire in the living room. For the 5 of us cousins, Katie, 13, me 12, Ben, 11, me at 10, and Charlie 10, it was a night of sugar highs, wrapped gifts, and snaking cookies from the dessert table. But this year, there was Jake. Jake, the cousin no one talked about. At 28, he was almost twice our age and carried a reputation that even the adults tiptoed around. Grandma hadn't mentioned him once before Christmas Eve, and when he showed up that night, the mood shifted like a candle blown out. He towered over Grandma in the doorway, lanky in a battered leather jacket. His greasy hair was slicked back in a way that looked casual, but every movement felt calculated. When he smiled, it wasn't warm. It was sharp, like a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. The adults murmured awkward hellos, but when Jake's hollow laughter rang out, they quickly turned back to their wine glasses. He didn't care. His eyes scanned the room, lingering a little too long when they landed on us kids. We didn't know Jake. He hadn't been to Christmas in years. All I knew about him was from the whispers I'd overheard over the years. Fragments of adult conversations cut off when I entered the room. Trouble with the law? Something with a friend of his? He was always off. When Jake wandered into the living room after dinner, his arrival felt like a storm cloud settling over the room. He leaned against the doorway, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, and looked us over like he was sizing us up. "Looks like the kid table's having fun," he said, his voice thick with mockery. "What are you up to? Watching Christmas movies?" "Cute." Katie, always the boldest, rolled her eyes. "We're just hanging out." Jake smirked and stepped into the room. "Hanging out? That's lame. You want to do something fun?" "We're fine," Katie said, her voice sharp, but Jake ignored her. He sauntered over to the couch and flopped down, stretching his arms across the back like he owned the place. "Truth or dare," he said, clapping his hands together. Katie scoffed. "We don't." "I'm in," Ben interrupted, sitting up straighter. Ben was always eager to prove he wasn't afraid of anything, Jake's grin widened. That's the spirit. Katie shot Ben a glare, but said nothing as Jake leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Here are the rules. You pick truth, you answer honestly. You pick dare, you do it. No whining, no backing out. If you refuse, you owe me. And trust me, you don't want to owe me. What happens if we don't want to play? Mia asked softly, clutching her stuffed reindeer to her chest. Jake's smirk sharpened. You don't get to not play. The first few rounds seemed harmless, even kind of fun. Jake dared Ben to eat a spoonful of ketchup mixed with hot sauce, making him gag but laugh at the same time. He asked Mia who her crush was at school, which made her blush and mumble something none of us could hear. Katie had to sing Silent Night in a goofy voice. We laughed, even Mia. But then Jake leaned back on the couch, his grin shifting. Something darker crept into his expression. Charlie, he said. Truth or dare? Charlie puffed up his chest, eager to impress. Dare. Jake's smile widened, exposing teeth. I dare you to punch Ben hard. The laughter evaporated. The room went silent, the fire crackling in the background. Charlie's face froze, and Ben's eyes widened. I'm not doing that, Charlie said quickly. Jake shrugged, his voice calm but ice cold. Then, you owe me. Come on, Jake, that's messed up, Katie said, her voice rising. Jake ignored her, his eyes fixed on Charlie like a wolf watching its prey. Your choice. Punch him, or you're in my debt. And I always collect. Charlie glanced at Ben, who shook his head, mouthing, don't do it. But Jake's words had sunk their claws into Charlie. He balled his fist, hesitated for a moment, then swung at Ben's arm. It wasn't much of a punch, but Ben yelped, clutching his arm. What the hell, Charlie? Jake clapped, his laughter sharp and cutting. Good job, kid. You've got some fight in you. Can we stop now? Mia asked, her voice trembling. Jake's smile vanished. The game's not over. Katie was next. Truth or dare? Jake asked, leaning closer to her, his voice low and menacing. Dare! Katie snapped, defiant. Jake tilted his head, his grin returning. I dare you to slap your sister. Mia gasped. No way. Katie's jaw clenched. I'm not doing that. Jake's eyes gleamed. Then you owe me. And like I said, I collect. Katie stared at him, her fists tightening. For a moment I thought she'd stand up to him, but then her shoulders sagged. She turned to Mia, her face crumpling with guilt. I'm sorry, she whispered, then raised her hand and gave Mia the lightest slap on the cheek. Mia's eyes filled with tears. I hate this game. Jake, stop, I shouted, standing up. This isn't funny anymore. Jake chuckled, unbothered. Oh, it's hilarious. But fine, your turn, truth or dare. I hesitated. My pulse pounded in my ears. Dare. Jake's grin widened, colder than ever. I dare you to stick your hand in the fireplace. The fire crackled behind me, its warmth brushing my back. My stomach churned as I stared at Jake, his face smug and twisted. No way, Katie said, standing beside me now. He's not doing that. Jake shrugged, his voice casual. Your choice. Do it or owe me. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. I'm not doing it, I said firmly, my voice shaking but loud. Jake's grin didn't falter. Heh, suit yourself. You're on my list now. The game dragged on, each round worse than the last. Jake dared Ben to crawl under the Christmas tree while we threw ornaments at him. He made Charlie eat a clove of garlic and chase it with eggnog. He dared Mia to crawl across the floor barking like a dog. None of us wanted to play anymore, but every time we tried to stop, Jake's words hung over us like a shadow. You owe me. When Grandma finally poked her head in, Jake slipped effortlessly back into his harmless act, laughing and brushing off our protests. She asked no questions, too distracted by the noise coming from the dining room. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, none of us could sleep. Jake's voice echoed in my head. "You're on my list now." It happened last Christmas. Snow fell softly over our suburban neighborhood, blanketing the houses in a serene quietness that only the holiday season could bring. The twinkling Christmas lights on the houses glowed in the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the freshly fallen snow. My cousin Jared had always been the prankster in the family, an instigator who found pleasure in pushing the boundaries of what was funny and what was downright cruel. After the festivities had died down and most of the adults were in a post-dinner daze, Jared turned to me with that mischievous glint in his eye. He leaned in close, his breath smelling faintly of eggnog, and said, "Let's play one last game." I was wary, but intrigued. Jared's games were infamous, ranging from harmless pranks to downright dangerous stunts. But it was Christmas, and I didn't want to be the killjoy cousin. He handed me a small, crudely wrapped box and grinned. "We're going to leave a little present for the neighbors," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "But here's the twist. You have to sneak into their yard and leave it on the porch." "What's in the box?" I asked, eyeing the package suspiciously. "Just some random junk," Jared said with a shrug. "It's all for fun." Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I didn't want to back out. Not on Christmas. Not with Jared watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to chicken out. I pulled on my boots and jacket, bracing myself against the cold, and followed him out into the snowy night. The neighbor's house was dark, except for the soft glow of their Christmas tree in the living room window. Jared hung back at the edge of their yard, crouching behind a hedge. "Go on," he whispered. "Just leave it on the porch." My heart raced as I tiptoed through the snow, the box tucked under my arm. The crunch of my boots sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. When I reached the porch, I set the box down carefully and turned to leave. That's when the porch light flicked on. "Hey, who's out there?" The gruff voice of Mr. Connolly, our elderly neighbor, boomed through the night. Panic set in. I froze like a deer caught in headlights, unsure of whether to run or try to explain. Before I could decide, the front door flew open and Mr. Connolly stepped out, his massive frame silhouetted in the doorway. I stammered an apology, trying to explain it was just a harmless prank, but he wasn't having it. He dragged me inside, sat me down, and called my parents. The shame of having my parents show up, scold me in front of Mr. Connolly, and drag me home was almost unbearable. Jared, of course, had vanished by the time I got back. Later that night, as I lay in bed, still fuming, Jared knocked softly on my bedroom door. He slipped inside, his face glowing with amusement. "Man, you're such an easy target," he said, chuckling. "You should have seen your face." I glared at him, seething. "You planned that, didn't you?" "Of course I did," he said, grinning. "It's all part of the game." That was the last straw. I told him to get out, and he left, still laughing under his breath. But as I lay there, something didn't sit right. What was in the box? Jared had refused to tell me, and in all the chaos, I hadn't thought to open it. Curiosity got the better of me. I snuck downstairs, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped out the back door. The box was gone. Either Mr. Connolly had taken it inside or someone else had. Disappointed, I turned to go back inside when I noticed something odd in the snow. A trail of footprints, but not mine. These were larger, heavier, and they didn't lead back to Jared's hiding spot. They led to the woods behind our houses. I followed them, flashlight trembling in my hand. The tracks ended at a cluster of trees where I found the box, torn open and empty. But the snow around it was smeared with something dark, something red. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't paint. It wasn't ketchup. It was blood. I ran back home as fast as I could, locking every door and window behind me. The next morning, Jared acted like nothing had happened. But when I confronted him again about the box, his grin faltered, just for a moment. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said, his voice unusually serious. "But don't worry, it wasn't your fault. You're just an easy target." He wouldn't say anything more, and to this day I don't know what was in that box or why he wanted me to deliver it. Jared moved away a few months later, and we haven't talked much since. Every Christmas, though, I can't help but think of that night, the box, the blood, and Jared's words echoing in my mind, "You're such an easy target." Christmas dinner at my parents' house has always been a spectacle, the kind of gathering that leaves you in a food coma for days, surrounded by laughter, the hum of conversation, and the occasional clatter of dishes as everyone piles their plates high. My mom goes all out every year. Glazed ham, buttery mashed potatoes, roasted veggies, pies, and cookies. The whole house smells like cinnamon, pine, and everything cozy about the holidays. This particular Christmas wasn't any different, or at least it didn't seem like it at first. My parents had invited the usual group, aunts, uncles, cousins, and a few family friends. It was the kind of crowd where you had to squeeze past chairs to get to the buffet table and shout to be heard over the chaos. 20 people, easy. I was sipping mulled wine, caught up in the whirl of holiday cheer when I first noticed him. He was sitting at the far end of the dining table, laughing at one of my Uncle Joe's stories, a glass of red wine in hand, the deep ruby liquid catching the glow of the chandelier. His clothes were unremarkable, a dark green sweater and neatly pressed slacks. He didn't stand out, and maybe that was the problem. He blended in too well. At first, I didn't think much of it. With so many people crammed into one house, it wasn't unusual for me to miss a new face. But something gnawed at the edge of my mind. There was no empty chair at the table earlier. I was sure of it. Yet there he was, laughing softly, as if he'd always been there. "Who's that?" I asked my cousin Maria as I passed her the bread basket. She followed my gaze. "No idea. Neighbor, maybe? You know your parents. Always inviting someone." I frowned. Sure, my parents were welcoming, but they usually introduced newcomers. "Dad didn't say anything," I muttered. Maria shrugged and went back to buttering her roll. I couldn't let it go. I kept glancing at him throughout dinner. He was polite, chiming in here and there, nodding at stories, smiling faintly. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. After dinner, the party migrated to the living room. Coffee was poured, pie was served, and the noise settled into a contented hum. The man sat on the couch, chatting with Aunt Linda about her last trip to Paris. He asked her questions, charming and attentive, like he genuinely cared. Aunt Linda looked delighted. That's when I decided to ask my mom, "Hey, who's that guy?" "Which one?" she asked, glancing around. The one talking to Aunt Linda." Her brow furrowed. "I thought your dad invited him." I don't think so. He didn't introduce him." Mom's frown deepened. "Well, maybe he's with someone else. I'll check." I watched as she made her rounds. Dad, Aunt Linda, Uncle Joe, my brother Luke. Each time, her confusion grew. Finally, she returned to me, her voice low. "No one knows who he is." I glanced back at the man. He was now helping Grandma adjust her chair. She patted his arm warmly, like they were old friends. "Doesn't act like a stranger," I said. Mom's unease mirrored my own. "No, he doesn't." Tension began to spread. Little clusters of us whispered in the kitchen and hallway, trying to figure him out. "Maybe he's scoping the place," Luke suggested, glancing toward the living room, waiting for a moment to grab something. "Hasn't done anything," I countered, though my stomach churned. "What if he's dangerous?" Maria whispered. "What if he has a weapon?" Her words hung in the air, too heavy to dismiss. Before we could debate it further, Uncle Joe, already tipsy, decided to handle it. "I'll ask him," he declared. "Joe, don't," Mom hissed, but it was too late. Joe clapped a hand on the man's shoulder. "Hey, you've been the life of the party tonight. Tell me, who invited you?" The man smiled, calm and unbothered. "I thought this was an open house," he said smoothly. "Martha told me all about your Christmas dinners. Said I'd feel right at home." Joe blinked. "Martha?" "Yes," the man said, tilting his head slightly. "Your sister, right? She told me you wouldn't mind." Joe stumbled back, his face pale. "Martha's been gone for years," he muttered, before laughing nervously and retreating to the kitchen. When he told us what the man had said, the air seemed to leave the room. Aunt Martha had died 5 years ago. By the time anyone worked up the nerve to confront him again, he was gone. His coat wasn't by the door. His wine glass sat untouched on the coffee table. Dad checked the porch while Luke searched the backyard. Both came back empty-handed. "Just left?" Mom asked, her voice incredulous. "Looks like it," Dad replied. I wandered over to the couch where he'd been sitting. The cushion was smooth, as though no one had been there at all. It wasn't until after the guests left that we found the envelope tucked neatly among the branches of the Christmas tree. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded carefully. In precise handwriting, it read, "Thank you for the warmth. Merry Christmas." We couldn't stop talking about him in the days that followed. Who was he? How did he know about Aunt Martha? And why our family? Weeks later, as we took the tree down, we found something else. Deep among the branches, there was a photo. It was of us, taken that night. Everyone was gathered around the dining table, laughing, plates piled high. At the very edge of the frame, there he was, the stranger. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at us. The next Christmas, my parents hosted dinner again. Everything was the same, the food, the laughter, the warmth. But his absence was palpable, an unspoken shadow over the evening. At one point, I thought I saw him. Just a flicker, sitting on the couch, smiling faintly. But when I blinked, the couch was empty. Every Christmas since, I've felt it. That faint prickling at the back of my neck, like someone's watching. I don't know if it's fear or expectation that keeps me checking the tree. Part of me dreads finding another photo. Part of me hopes I will. So far I haven't. But I know he's still out there, waiting, watching. Christmas Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. Snow blanketed the neighborhood in soft white. The air was crisp enough to sting your cheeks, and the glow of lights in every window made the world feel calm, almost magical. That night, I bundled up in my coat, pulled on my gloves, and clipped the leash onto Buddy's collar. My golden retriever wagged his tail furiously, his breath puffing little clouds of steam against the glass. "Let's go, boy," I said, laughing as he nudged the door impatiently. The cold hit me the moment we stepped outside, but it was the good kind of cold, the kind that made you feel alive. The street was quiet, with most people inside wrapping last-minute gifts or settling in for the night. Buddy trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, tail wagging as we made our way toward the park at the end of the block. It wasn't until we reached the park that the feeling started. A faint unease, like the air had shifted somehow. The street lamps hummed softly, their light catching the falling snow in a glittering haze, but the silence felt heavier here, oppressive. Even Buddy, usually eager to explore, moved slower, his ears twitching at every sound. That's when I saw him. He stood under a flickering street lamp just ahead, his face obscured by the hood of a dark jacket. He didn't move, didn't seem to notice us at first, but the sight of him set something off in me, an instinctive prickle of tension I couldn't explain. I tightened my grip on Buddy's leash. "Come on, boy," I murmured, steering us toward the opposite path. The man stepped forward. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp against the stillness. "Have you seen a dog?" Buddy stopped in his tracks, his ears perking up. A low growl rumbled in his throat, something I hadn't heard in years, not since the time a stranger had reached for him at the park. I hesitated. "What kind of dog?" I asked, my voice careful, steady. "A German Shepherd," he said. "Big, black and tan." I glanced at Buddy, who was stiff now, his hackles raised. "No, I haven't seen one. Sorry." The man took a step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "You sure? He might have run through here. You walk this way often?" Something about the way he said it, the casual question that didn't feel casual at all, made my stomach tighten. I tugged Buddy's leash gently, trying to put more distance between us. "Good luck finding him," I said, turning away. Buddy resisted at first, his growl deepening, but I gave another tug and he relented. My heart pounded as we walked quickly toward the far end of the park. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on us. The man's voice followed, calm and unsettling. "Be careful out here." Back home, I locked the door and checked it twice. Buddy paced near the window, his ears flicking at every sound. I turned on the TV, trying to shake the unease, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. Why had he asked if I walked that way often? It wasn't a normal question for someone worried about a lost dog. And the way he'd hesitated when I asked what kind of dog, like he'd made it up on the spot. None of it sat right. Buddy barked suddenly, startling me. He was at the window now, his growl low and steady. My stomach dropped as I approached, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. There, on the sidewalk across the street, was the man. He wasn't moving, just standing under the streetlight with his hood up, hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking at the house exactly, more like he was studying the yard, or maybe Buddy's tracks in the snow. I stepped back quickly, my pulse racing. "Buddy, quiet," I whispered, though his growls didn't stop. Grabbing my phone, I dialed the non-emergency police line. "There's a man outside my house," I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice low. "He's been standing there for a while. He followed me home from the park." "Can you describe him?" she asked. "Hood up, dark jacket, medium height. He's just standing there." "Has he approached your house?" "No, but it doesn't feel right." "We'll send a patrol car to check it out. Stay inside and don't engage with him." I hung up and peeked out again. He hadn't moved, just stood there like a shadow against the snow, perfectly still. When the police arrived, their car crept down the street, its headlights off. One of the officers got out, approaching the man cautiously. Buddy barked louder, his tail stiff as I watched through the curtain. The man didn't run. He didn't argue. He said something to the officer, nodded, then turned and walked away. The officer watched him go before returning to the car, which pulled into my driveway a moment later. Said he was looking for his dog, the officer explained. We told him to move along. Followed me home from the park, I said. He stood outside for 15 minutes. The officer frowned. He didn't seem dangerous, but we'll keep an eye on the area. Call us if he comes back. I nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right. I watched the patrol car disappear down the street, the feeling of safety vanishing with it. The next morning, I found the footprints. They led from the sidewalk to my front door, then around the side of the house to the backyard. My stomach turned as I followed them, every step deliberate, measured. At the back door, they stopped, so close to the threshold, it felt like he'd been testing it. Buddy sniffed at the door, whining softly. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, that the man had just been curious. But the thought of him standing there, so close while I'd sat unaware inside, made my skin crawl. 2 days later, I decided to walk Buddy again. It was broad daylight this time, with the sun gleaming off the fresh snow. I told myself it was safe. There were people outside, cars passing by, but my heart pounded as we approached the park. Buddy stopped suddenly, his ears pricking up. I followed his gaze and felt my breath catch. The man was there, standing under the same flickering street lamp. He didn't move, didn't call out this time. He just stood, watching us. I tightened my grip on Buddy's leash, my breath coming in short bursts. "Let's go, Buddy," I murmured, turning us toward home. But as we moved away, the man spoke. "I'm not looking for a dog," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I just wanted to know if you'd notice." I froze, my heart thundering. When I turned back, he was already walking away, disappearing into the trees. I never saw him again, but the unease never left me. Every time Buddy barked at a shadow or growled at a sound I couldn't hear, I felt the weight of his words pressing on me. "I just wanted to know if you'd notice." The police never found him. No crimes had been reported, they said, no reason to detain him. But I knew better. He'd been testing me, seeing how close he could get. And now, every time I walk Buddy, I wonder if he's still watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. Every year, like clockwork, Mrs. Hargrove, our elderly neighbor 2 doors down, sent us a Christmas card. It was always something cheerful and innocuous: snowy cottages, glittering ornaments, maybe a jovial Santa Claus. Inside, in her loopy, old-fashioned handwriting, she'd scrawl something simple: "Warm wishes, Mrs. H." It was a harmless tradition. Mary, my wife, loved it. She'd pin the card to her fridge every year with the same snowman-shaped magnet. "She's so sweet," Mary would say, smiling. "You should check on her more often." And every year I'd nod, maybe shovel her driveway when the snow got bad, but we weren't close. She was just one of those neighbors you wave to but rarely talk to beyond pleasantries. This year, her card arrived as expected, a week before Christmas. But when Mary opened it, her expression froze. "What is it?" I asked, putting down my coffee. Wordlessly, she handed it to me. The front showed a cheerful snowman holding a broom, but the inside stopped me cold. The handwriting wasn't Mrs. Hargrove's. The loopy script had been replaced with sharp, jagged letters, and the message was anything but cheerful. "I've been inside your house. Merry Christmas." The words seemed to leach the warmth from the room. The Christmas lights on the tree twinkled. The scent of cinnamon candles lingered in the air, but none of it felt comforting anymore. "It has to be a prank," Mary said finally, her voice shaky. "Probably," I said, though I wasn't convinced. There was no return address, no postmark. It hadn't been mailed. It had been slipped into our mailbox by hand. Mary chewed her lip nervously. "You don't think Mrs. Hargrove actually wrote this, do you?" "No way," I said. "It doesn't even look like her handwriting." "But what if she's in trouble? Maybe someone else wrote it for her." It wasn't impossible. Mrs. Hargrove was in her late 70s and lived alone. If something had happened, this might be her way of reaching out. "Let's check on her," I said, already grabbing my coat. Mrs. Hargrove answered the door almost immediately, beaming in her festive Christmas sweater. "David, Mary, what a nice surprise. Come in, come in." Her house smelled of fresh cookies, the cozy warmth a stark contrast to the chill clinging to me. "Hi, Mrs. Hargrove," Mary began, her smile tight. "We got your Christmas card." "Oh, you did?" she said brightly. "Aren't they lovely? I found a box of them at the craft store, half off." Mary and I exchanged a glance. "Did you write the cards yourself?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Of course," she said, then paused. "Wait, did it not have my note in it?" I wrote a little something about how grateful I am to have such kind neighbors. "It had a message," Mary said carefully, "but it wasn't kind." Mrs. Hargrove's face fell. "What do you mean?" I pulled the card from my pocket and handed it to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she squinted at the words, holding the card close to her glasses. "Oh my," she whispered, "that's not my writing. I would never." Her voice trailed off, her brow furrowing. For a moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Mary pressed gently. The old woman shook her head. "I left my cards at the post office on Tuesday. I even watched the clerk stamp them. This isn't mine." We left shortly after, more uneasy than when we'd arrived. If Mrs. Hargrove hadn't written the card, someone had gone out of their way to impersonate her, and they knew where we lived. Mary couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, she double-checked the locks, kept the curtains drawn tight, and jumped at every noise. "You really think someone was inside?" she asked me one night. "It's a prank," I insisted, though the words felt hollow. "I've been inside your house. The message was too specific, too invasive. If it was a joke, it wasn't funny." On Christmas Eve, Mary called me into the living room. Her face was pale, her voice trembling. "Look," she said, pointing to the window. In the fresh snow outside were footprints. They led from the sidewalk to our front door, then around the side of the house to the back. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, my breath fogging in the icy air. The footprints were fresh. I followed them to the back door, where they stopped abruptly. There were no more tracks, just nothing. Back inside, Mary was clutching her phone. "We need to call the police," she said. "Let's check the house first," I replied. Make sure nothing's missing." Room by room we searched. Nothing was out of place, but the unease was suffocating. Someone had been here. Maybe still was. In the basement, I stopped cold. The small window near the ceiling was slightly ajar, letting in a draft. "David?" Mary's voice came from the top of the stairs. I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the footprints in the thin layer of dust beneath the window. They led to the stairs and back. The police arrived quickly, but their reassurance felt thin. "Could be a trespasser," one officer suggested. "Sometimes they break in just to prove they can." "Why?" Mary asked. "Control," he said simply. "They like knowing they've scared you." Before leaving, they promised to patrol the neighborhood more often. But what good was that when someone had already been inside? On Christmas morning, we found another card in the mailbox. Mary refused to touch it. My hands shook as I opened it. And inside was a single line of writing. "It's my favorite house on the street. The red curtains suit you." No signature, no return address, just the words. Mary packed her bag that afternoon. "We're staying at my parents' for a while," she said. I didn't argue. Weeks passed. We moved back eventually, and nothing else happened, but the unease never left. Every creak of the floorboards felt too loud. Every misplaced item felt suspicious. We never found out who sent the cards or why. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I think about the message. "I've been inside your house." And I wonder if they're waiting for next Christmas. The apartment pressed in around me, its quiet too thick, its shadows too long for Christmas Eve. The hum of the radiator rattled like a broken metronome, the only sound accompanying the faint flicker of Christmas lights framing the window. Outside, snow fell in lazy flurries, blanketing the fire escape with a pristine, unbroken layer of white, as though the world outside had been abandoned. I leaned back on the couch, nursing a whiskey that was more ice than drink. The radio hummed a carol I used to love, its melody stripped of the magic I once felt. Christmas had become a hollow season, a reminder of how much had slipped away. My family was scattered, some too far to visit, others too angry to try. We hadn't been together since my father's funeral years ago. And even then, there'd been more silence than words. On the counter, an outdated landline sat untouched, a relic I kept plugged in for emergencies. I couldn't remember the last time it had rung. That was why, when the shrill sound of the ringer pierced the stillness, I froze. The second ring jolted me. I set my glass down and crossed the room, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I said, the word uneven, almost a question. For a moment, there was nothing but static, low and droning, like the breath of something just out of sight. Then a voice broke through, soft and trembling. "Please, help me." The air seemed to freeze, the static crawling beneath my skin. "Who is this?" I asked, gripping the receiver tighter. The voice cracked with a sob. "I don't know what to do. Please." "Wait, who are you? Where are you?" Before I could get an answer, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my breath shallow. A prank, I told myself. It had to be. But when I glanced at the caller ID, my stomach dropped. The call had come from my own number. I dialed back immediately, my fingers trembling. The ringtone barely sounded before static swallowed the line. Beneath the hiss, I thought I heard something. Faint whispers, too broken to make sense of. But one phrase seemed to surface, clear as day. "I don't want to lose you." My chest tightened. The words were faint, tangled in static, but the cadence was his. just like the nights he called me in for dinner, his voice low but insistent. I set the phone down and turned away, but the sound of that voice lingered, clawing at the edges of my mind. The landline was connected to my father's house. The old number was tied to the line I hadn't used or thought about in years. I tried to shake the feeling as the night dragged on, but the apartment seemed to shift around me. Shadows stretched too far, and the soft creaks of settling wood felt louder, more deliberate. By midnight, I couldn't stand it anymore. Grabbing my coat and keys, I stepped into the freezing night. The drive to the outskirts of town was slow, the snow thickening as I moved farther from the city. By the time I reached the gravel driveway, it was buried beneath heavy drifts. The house stood like a silhouette against the pale glow of the moon, its edges softened by years of neglect. The sight of it hit me like a fist to the chest. The porch sagged under the weight of ice, the windows dark, their glass streaked with frost. It was exactly as I remembered it, and yet it felt unfamiliar, like something had shifted in its absence. I hesitated at the door, key in hand. The cold bit into my fingers as I turned the lock and stepped inside. The smell hit first, stale air and damp wood. My flashlight swept across the empty living room, the beam catching dust motes that drifted like ghosts. The landline sat in its usual place on the side table, the cord coiled neatly, the hand set off the hook. The faint crunch of snow outside made my blood run cold. I turned sharply, my flashlight beam catching muddy footprints leading from the back door. My breath hitched as I stepped into the hallway. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint sound of something creaking upstairs. Each step up the staircase felt like a betrayal, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. At the top, I paused, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows down the hallway. The closet door was ajar. "Who's there?" I said, my voice cracking. The door shifted, and then I saw him, a man crouched inside, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Don't call anyone," he whispered, raising his hands in surrender. "Please." He was gaunt, his clothes hanging off his frame like rags. What are you doing here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. His breath came in shallow gasps. "I thought it was safe," he rasped. "I thought I could hide. But they'll find me." "They?" He shook his head, pressing his palms to his temples. "It starts with the calls, always. You think it's nothing, but it's not. It never is." By the time the sun rose, the stranger was gone, slipping into the snowy woods with nothing but my flashlight to guide him. I sat in my car, staring at the old house as daylight hit the frost-covered windows, giving the decaying structure an almost ethereal glow. The landline still sat off the hook, its cord coiled like a sleeping snake. On the passenger seat beside me lay the object the stranger had left behind, a small, rusted key tied to a piece of string. It fit the lock to a hidden drawer in my father's desk. Inside, I found papers, letters my father had never sent, his handwriting shaky but familiar. They were addressed to me, full of apologies I'd never hear in person. His words blurred as I read them, anger and regret twisting together in my chest. I'd spent years blaming him for the silence, but maybe he'd been reaching out, and I just didn't know how to listen. The key was small, fragile, its edges dulled with time. My father must have carried it for years, knowing what lay locked away but unable to face it, and now, here it was in my hands. A question I couldn't ignore any longer. As the light stretched over the house, I thought about the stranger's words. It always starts with the calls. And now comes the final clash, as the light stretched over the house. I thought about the stranger's words. It always stretched with the cause. The line between victim and savior blurred as I sat in that morning light, and the weight of the past finally settled over me. Christmas Eve had wrapped the house in its usual comfort. The tree glowed softly in the corner of the living room, casting twinkling reflections on the window panes. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, adding to the warmth that made the cold wind outside seem like a distant memory. Claire sat next to me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, holding a mug of cocoa. Our kids, Ethan and Lily, were curled under blankets, their sugar-fueled excitement fading into drowsy contentment. The room felt heavy with peace, the kind you only get during the holidays. "It's supposed to snow tonight," Claire murmured, her voice slow and sleepy. "Can you imagine a more perfect Christmas morning?" I smiled at her, shifting slightly to adjust the blanket draped over us. "Nope, this one's pretty perfect." The wind picked up, rattling faintly against the windows. I glanced toward the frosted panes as a sudden flash lit up the room. It was bright and fast, a single burst that washed over everything. The shadows of the ornaments danced wildly on the walls for a fraction of a second before the light vanished. "What was that?" Claire asked, sitting up straight. Her cocoa sloshed slightly, nearly spilling over the rim. "I don't know," I said, frowning. I got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back. Outside, the street was quiet and still, the snow on the lawn untouched. The neighboring houses were dark, their Christmas lights blinking steadily against the gloom. "Lightning," Claire suggested, though she sounded unsure. I shook my head. "There's no storm." "Maybe someone's taking pictures of their lights? With a flash?" Claire joined me, peering out into the night. At this hour, the air seemed heavier now, the faint hum of the fire the only sound. I scanned the street again, but there was nothing unusual. Just snow and silence. "Probably nothing," I said, forcing a smile as I dropped the curtain. "Let's get the kids to bed." Claire nodded, but the unease in her eyes lingered. The next morning, the snow had come as promised, a thick blanket covering the neighborhood in pristine white. Ethan and Lily were already begging to go outside, their excitement making it impossible to wait until breakfast. I told them to bundle up as I stepped onto the porch to grab the paper. That's when I saw it. A plain, white envelope sitting on the top step. The snow around it was untouched, no footprints leading to or from the spot where it rested. My first thought was that it was from a neighbor, a holiday card delivered late, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't sealed with tape or a sticker, just folded neatly, the kind of simplicity that seemed deliberate. "Claire?" I called, stepping back inside. She was pouring coffee in the kitchen, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. "Did you leave this out here?" She turned, her brow furrowing at the envelope in my hand. "No, what is it? I don't know," I said, sliding my thumb under the fold. Inside was a small stack of photographs, and as I flipped through them, my heart began to race. The first photo was of our living room. The tree glowed softly in the background, the stockings hanging over the fireplace. Claire and I were sitting on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. The second photo was of Ethan and Lily, curled under their blankets, their faces slack with sleep. The third photo made my breath catch. It was of Claire and me again, but this time from outside the window. The reflection in the glass showed the faint outline of a shadowy figure holding a camera. The last photo was the worst. It was taken in our bedroom. Claire and I were fast asleep, the angle low, as though the camera had been placed at the foot of the bed. The blankets were drawn up to our chests, our faces soft in the dim light. Someone had been inside. "Is this some kind of joke?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. She was staring at the photos, her hands trembling as she fanned them out on the kitchen counter. "Who would joke like this?" I said, my own voice rising. My chest was tight, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "The doors were locked, the windows too. We need to call someone," she said. "The police?" The officer who arrived was polite but clearly skeptical. He flipped through the photos slowly, his frown deepening. "You're sure you didn't hear anything during the night?" he asked. "Yes," Claire said, her voice firm. "We would have heard someone in the house." He nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "Any security cameras?" "No," I admitted, feeling a wave of regret. The officer sighed, handing the photos back. "We'll file a report and I'll have someone patrol the area tonight," he said. "But without any evidence of forced entry, it's hard to say what we're dealing with here. Could be a prank. Creepy, but harmless." "It doesn't feel harmless," Claire said quietly. The officer gave her a faint smile before stepping back out into the snow. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt too loud, every shadow in the room too deep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Who had taken the photos? How had they gotten inside? And why? At some point, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke the next morning, I went to the porch, half expecting to find another envelope. Instead, I found something worse. A camera buried halfway in the snow. The lens was cracked, the casing scratched and half frozen. I picked it up carefully, brushing the frost away as I pressed the power button. The screen flickered weakly, showing the last photo taken. It was of me, standing on the porch, staring directly into the lens. I dropped the camera and stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps as Claire came rushing down the stairs. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice frantic. "We're getting a security system today," I said, my voice shaking, "and we're never skipping it again." She nodded, her own fear mirrored in her wide eyes. "We never found out who left the photos or the camera, but every year, as Christmas Eve approaches, I still feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, the faint suggestion of a shadow just beyond the glow of the lights. And whenever I see a flash in the dark, I remember the camera and the way it captured me before I even knew it was there." It was nearly midnight on Christmas Eve when Rennie noticed the bag. Snow blanketed the street outside, a silent, undisturbed expanse that stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the streetlights. Inside, the crackle of the fireplace should have been comforting, but the warmth did little to push back the heavy chill in the air. The house felt too quiet, too still. Bailey, our golden retriever, sat stiffly by the front window, his ears pinned back and his gaze locked on the darkness beyond the glass. His low growl rumbled through the room like a distant storm. "Did you hear that?" Rennie asked suddenly, her voice tight and barely above a whisper. I looked up from the tangled string of ribbon in my lap. "Hear what?" She hesitated, then glanced back toward the window. A thump, like someone on the porch. I set the ribbon down, frowning as I got up. "It's probably just the wind." Rennie moved closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "No, I heard something. It sounded deliberate." I joined her, peering out into the swirling snow. At first, all I could see was the empty street, the occasional gust of wind stirring the powdery drifts. But then, there it was, a small, festively wrapped bag sitting precisely in the center of our front porch. "Did you order something?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Rennie shook her head, her expression uneasy. "No. And who delivers this late?" Bailey let out a sharp bark, backing away from the door as if the bag carried a scent only he could detect. "Stay here," I said, pulling on my coat. "Wait," Rennie whispered, grabbing my arm. "Maybe we should just leave it." I hesitated. The pristine bag seemed harmless enough, but the unease in her voice made me pause. Still, curiosity nudged me forward. "It's probably from a neighbor," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. The cold air bit at my face as I stepped outside. Snow crunched underfoot, but the bag sat untouched by the falling flakes. No footprints led to it or away. It was as if it had simply materialized. Back inside, I placed the bag on the coffee table. Bailey retreated to the corner of the room, his growl now a low, persistent whine. "We shouldn't open it," Rennie said, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Someone left it for us," I said, though my own voice betrayed doubt. "We should at least see what's inside." I reached into the bag and pulled out a single object, a small brass key with a heart-shaped bow. Rennie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's my old diary key," she whispered, her face pale. I turned it over in my hand, the weight of it unfamiliar yet vaguely familiar. "From college?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "I lost it during the move." "How did it—" Reaching back into the bag, I pulled out a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and sickeningly familiar. "It's nice to be close again. Merry Christmas." Rennie's breath hitched. "Eric?" she said, the word slipping out like a curse. The name hit me like a blow to the chest. Eric Langley. A name I hadn't heard in years. He'd been Rennie's friend in college, though friend wasn't quite the right word. He'd been obsessed, sending her letters, showing up uninvited, refusing to let go, even after she began dating me. When she finally cut him off, he had disappeared. Or so he thought. "That's impossible," I said, shaking my head. "He moved overseas. We haven't heard from him in over a decade." Rennie's eyes darted toward the window, her fear palpable. "What if he's back?" The next morning, another bag appeared on the porch. This one held our wedding photo. The edges were singed, and our faces had been violently scratched out. Across the bottom, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "Did you miss me?" Bailey barked sharply, his tail tucked between his legs. The tension in the house was suffocating. We called the police. Officer Daniels listened patiently as we recounted the events. "Do you have any reason to believe this Eric Langley might be involved?" Rennie nodded, her voice shaking. He was obsessed with me. When I started dating my husband, he didn't take it well. Daniels fine. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, lock all your doors and windows. Call us if anything else happens." But the bags kept coming. Each one was worse than the last. A necklace Rennie had lost years ago, pages torn from an old book I thought I'd misplaced, and then a photo taken from outside our bedroom window. The caption on the back, "Always watching." We installed cameras, desperate for answers, but the footage only deepened our fear. One night, a figure appeared at the edge of the yard, standing motionless just beyond the glow of the porch light. He didn't move. He didn't approach. He simply watched. It happened a week later. Bailey began growling at the basement door, his hackles raised. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding as I opened it. The stairs creaked underfoot as I descended, the air thick with damp and decay. Halfway down, I froze. Words were scrawled in red paint on the far wall. I was here. Upstairs next. I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. He's been inside, I gasped. We need to leave. Now. We grabbed what we could and rushed to the car, but the engine wouldn't start. The tires had been slashed. My phone had no signal. Then we saw him. Eric stood at the end of the driveway, his dark coat blending into the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "Rennie," he called, his voice sharp and desperate. "Come back to me." "Get inside," I shouted, pulling her toward the house. We barricaded the door, my grip tight on the fireplace poker. The crash of breaking glass shattered the silence. Footsteps echoed from the back of the house, slow and deliberate. "You belong with me, Rennie," Eric's voice called out, closer now. "Leave us alone," she screamed. Eric stepped into the room, his eyes locking onto Rennie with a manic intensity. "I waited for you," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "But you shut me out. You forced me to watch." "This isn't love," I said, keeping the poker between us. "You need help." Eric sneered. "You don't understand. She's mine. She's always been mine." The sound of sirens shattered the tension. Eric's expression twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed before slipping out the broken window. Eric's hideout was discovered days later, an abandoned cabin filled with photos, mementos, and journal entries about Rennie. But Eric himself was gone. Weeks passed without incident, and we tried to move on. But on Christmas Eve, a package appeared on our doorstep. Inside was Rennie's childhood snow globe, the one her grandmother had given her and she thought lost forever. A note was attached. "Did you miss me? Merry Christmas." Every Christmas Eve since, we've found something waiting for us. A book, a trinket, a whispered reminder that Eric is still out there. We've moved, changed our numbers, but he always finds us. Some gifts can't be returned, and some nightmares never end. The first missing package didn't seem like a big deal. Diane had ordered new Christmas lights, and when she checked the tracking number, it said it had been delivered. But the porch was empty. Maybe it was dropped at the wrong house, I offered as she frowned at her phone. "Maybe," she muttered, but her tone was tight. By the time the second package disappeared, frustration had turned into suspicion. It was supposed to be a gift for our son Mike, some limited edition action figure he'd begged for all year. Diane had been thrilled to snag it online, but when the delivery notification came, the porch was bare. "That's 2 in a row," she said, her voice rising. "Someone's taking them." "It could just be a mistake," I said, though doubt had started creeping in. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where missing packages felt like a distant problem. But the third package confirmed it. By then, the kids were complaining that their presents hadn't arrived, and Diane was pacing the living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to figure out who's doing this," she said, her jaw tight. I dug an old webcam out of a drawer and taped it to the window above the porch. It wasn't fancy. Grainy footage, no motion detection. But it would record everything. "If someone's stealing them, we'll catch them," I said. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Diane and I sat in the glow of the Christmas tree, trying to enjoy the decorations. Mike and Lily were already in bed, their stockings hanging neatly by the fireplace, but the air felt heavy, the festive warmth unable to push back the creeping unease. The next morning, Diane rushed to the door when a delivery arrived. It was a small package, wrapped in brown paper with her name printed neatly on the label. She brought it inside, her brow furrowed as she set it on the counter. "Feel this," she said, handing it to me. It was light, far too light for the sturdy cardboard it was packed in. I shook it gently, hearing a faint rustle inside. Diane grabbed scissors and sliced through the tape. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the box. Inside was shredded paper. Nothing else. "That's it?" she said, her voice rising. She slammed the box onto the counter, her knuckles white. "This isn't just theft. Someone's messing with us." I pulled up the camera footage, fast-forwarding through hours of stillness, until I saw it. Just after sunset, a figure stepped into view from the edge of the frame. They moved with a deliberate, almost casual pace, their dark coat blending into the shadows. They didn't hesitate, didn't look around. They walked straight to the porch and crouched down, their back to the camera. As we watched, they reached into their coat and pulled out a knife. The blade glinted faintly in the dim light as they carefully sliced open the box. They pulled out the contents, what looked like a small gift bag, and held it up, tilting it back and forth as if inspecting it. Then, with the same methodical precision, they replaced the bag, pressed the tape back into place, and stood. They adjusted their coat, tucking the package under one arm, and walked out of frame. Diane's breath hitched. Resealing it? Who does that? I rewound the footage, pausing as the figure turned slightly toward the camera. The resolution was poor, but the shape of their face, the tilt of their head, it was unmistakable. "Matheson," I whispered. Matheson lived 2 doors down. He was an older man, late 60s, with a stiff posture and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. He'd lived in the neighborhood for years, mostly keeping to himself. We waved politely at him in passing, but had never exchanged more than a few words. Diane was already pacing. "We have to call the police." "Not yet," I said, though my stomach churned. "Let me talk to him first. Maybe there's an explanation." Her expression made it clear she didn't think much of the idea, but she didn't stop me. Matheson's porch was pristine, the snow shoveled into neat piles, a single wreath hanging on the door. I knocked twice, the sound sharp against the cold. He answered after a moment, his face calm and blank. "Hello," he said. "Matheson," I began, struggling to keep my tone steady. "We've had some packages go missing. I set up a camera, and it caught you on our porch." He didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. "I see." There was no denial, no apology, just 2 words, spoken with a calm that made my skin crawl. "Why?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why are you taking them? Why are you opening them?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, his head tilted slightly, and he smiled. A small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "To see," he said simply. "See what?" The smile lingered, faint and unreadable. "What you ordered." Before I could respond, he stepped back inside and closed the door. That night, I called the police. An officer came by, took my statement, and watched the footage with a frown. "It's a gray area," he said. "There's no evidence anything was stolen, and if he's returning the packages to the porch, well, it's not exactly a crime." "But he's on our property," Diane argued. "That's trespassing." The officer nodded but didn't seem convinced. "We'll talk to him, but without solid evidence, there's not much we can do." The next morning, I found another package on the porch. It was one of the ones that had gone missing earlier in the week. The tape had been carefully reapplied, the label intact. Inside was a single note, handwritten on plain white paper. "I've seen enough. Merry Christmas." Matheson never came to our porch again, but every so often, I catch him through his window, standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, or maybe at something I can't see. And whenever a package arrives, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching and waiting. The roads were empty, the world blanketed in snow that shimmered under the pale glow of streetlights. It was late on Christmas Eve, and I was driving home from my sister's party, my car cutting a solitary path through the stillness. The night had been warm and lively, full of laughter and holiday cheer. But now I felt the weight of the quiet, the kind of silence that settles in when the world is asleep. The radio hummed softly with carols, and the rhythmic crunch of my tires against the snow was oddly soothing. I was only a few miles from home when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, they seemed harmless, another late-night driver heading the same direction. But as the miles passed, they stayed close, too close, matching my every turn. The car was dark, its headlights unwavering. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they lived nearby or were simply taking the same route. But when I slowed down, they slowed too, maintaining the exact same distance. My hands tightened on the wheel as a faint prickle of unease crept up my spine. I turned onto a smaller side street, away from my usual route, hoping to loose them. The headlights followed. My chest tightened. The snow fell heavier now, blurring the edges of the road, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Each turn I took, they took. Every adjustment of my speed, they mirrored. It was deliberate. By the time I turned onto my street, my heart was racing. The dark houses, their windows glowing faintly with Christmas lights, felt both comforting and eerily distant. As I pulled into my driveway, the car behind me slowed. I watched in my rearview mirror, my breath fogging the glass, as it paused at the curb. For a moment, it just sat there, its headlights burning into the snowy darkness. Then, without warning, it sped off, its tires crunching through the snow as it disappeared down the street. I sat in my car, frozen. My house loomed ahead, its porch light flickering faintly in the falling snow. The silence felt suffocating now, the earlier warmth of the holiday gone. Finally, I grabbed my keys and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I peeked through the curtains, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a bright glow over the pristine snow. I tried to push the night's events out of my mind, chalking it up to holiday stress or an overactive imagination. But when I stepped outside to take out the trash, I stopped cold. Tied to the handle of my back door was a candy cane. It was pristine, its red and white stripes perfectly spiraled and tied with a neat ribbon that fluttered gently in the breeze. My breath caught as I stared at it, my thoughts racing. Who had left it? When? The snow around the back step was untouched. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I pulled the candy cane off the door, holding it in my trembling hands. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the ribbon felt stiff, almost brittle. I turned it over, half expecting to find a note or some clue as to who had left it, but there was nothing, just the candy cane, impossibly perfect, yet menacing in its simplicity. I called my sister, trying to rationalize it aloud. "Do you think it could have been a neighbor?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "A candy cane on your back door?" she said, her voice uneasy. "That's strange. Didn't you say someone was following you last night?" "Yeah," I admitted, "but it's probably just a coincidence. Right?" She didn't respond immediately. "Maybe you should call the police," she said finally. I didn't. Not yet. That night, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I checked the locks twice before going to bed. I drew the curtains tightly shut, but it didn't help. The memory of the headlights and the candy cane stayed with me, like shadows pressing against the edges of my mind. Sometime after midnight, I woke with a start. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. My throat was dry, so I got up to pour myself a glass of water. As I stood at the kitchen sink, staring into the darkness beyond the window, I heard it. 3 soft knocks at the back door. The sound was deliberate, measured, each knock spaced evenly apart. My chest tightened as I set the glass down carefully, the faint clink against the counter sounding deafening in the quiet. I crept to the back door, my breath shallow, and peered through the small curtain. The porch light glowed faintly, illuminating the snow-covered steps. It was empty. The snow was undisturbed, the ribbon from the candy cane fluttering slightly in the breeze. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any hint of movement, but the silence was absolute. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, as the sun rose and bathed the house in soft light, I mustered the courage to open the back door. My heart pounded as I looked down, half expecting another candy cane. Instead, there was nothing. For a moment, relief washed over me, but as I stepped outside, I noticed something in the snow, a single trail of footprints, leading away from the door and disappearing into the woods beyond the yard. They were larger than any I'd seen before, the deep impression suggesting someone or something heavy. I followed them to the edge of the trees, but the sight only made my stomach churn. The last footprint wasn't a boot or a shoe. It was bare. I called the police that morning. The officer who arrived listened politely but seemed unimpressed. "Probably just a prank," he said, though his words offered little comfort. "Let us know if it happens again." It hasn't. Not yet. But every Christmas, I still feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, the soft prickle of dread when I hear footsteps in the snow, and whenever I see a candy cane, perfectly curled and pristine, I wonder if they'll come back, and if next time they'll knock harder. The snow was falling softly, blanketing the quiet streets in a layer of white. It was Christmas Eve and the neighborhood was still, save for the occasional glow of twinkling lights in front windows and the faint hum of a distant car engine. I'd decided to take Max, my German Shepherd, out for a quick walk before settling in for the night. He tugged at the leash eagerly, his breath puffing out in quick bursts that mingled with the frost swirling around us. It was one of those nights where the silence felt heavier than usual, pressing against the skin like a thin sheet of ice. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath our feet. As we walked, I found myself glancing toward the park, where one of the street lights in the distance flickered faintly. I brushed it off as nothing, but the sight left a strange itch in the back of my mind. We'd rounded the corner toward the park when the flickering street light came into full view. It blinked erratically, casting jittery shadows across the pavement and nearby trees. Max hesitated, his ears twitching as he sniffed the cold air. I gave the leash a gentle tug, urging him forward, but my steps slowed as I watched the light. The flickering wasn't steady. It felt wrong, like a stuttering heartbeat. When we were about 20 feet away, the light blinked out entirely, plunging that stretch of the street into darkness. My breath fogged in the air as I stopped, staring at the spot where the glow had been. Max let out a low growl, his body tense, his ears pinned back. He shifted uneasily, his tail stiff and lowered, a signal that sent a chill rippling through me. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and breathy, cutting through the stillness. "James." I froze, my name hanging in the air like a shard of ice. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The sound came from the darkness beneath the extinguished streetlight. "Max!" Max barked sharply, pulling against the leash. His growl returned, low and insistent, vibrating up the leash and into my hand. My chest tightened as I scanned the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the darkened street, the faint outline of parked cars, and the snow-covered trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The word felt small, swallowed by the heavy quiet. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost like a sigh. James." I stumbled back a step, my heart pounding. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe it was the wind, carrying someone's voice from farther down the street. Maybe a prank, but how did they know my name? Max barked again, sharper this time, his gaze locked on the shadows beneath the streetlight. His growl deepened as he pulled against the leash, his body rigid. I tugged at the leash, urging him to move, but he resisted, his paws planted firmly in the snow. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The words echoed faintly, unanswered. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against my ears like cotton. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, laughter, some sound that would make this moment make sense. No, not a sound, just the hum of my heart, sounds that would make this moment make sense. Instead, I heard the snow crunch behind me. I spun around, pulling Max closer. The street behind us was empty, bathed in the faint glow of another streetlight farther down the block. The crunch came again, softer this time, like someone testing the weight of their steps. But there was no one there. Max whined, his growl fading into a nervous whimper. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at the darkened streetlight ahead. His tail twitched low and stiff, his body trembling slightly now. My pulse was hammering in my ears, each beat louder than the last. I took a step forward, then another, my eyes darting between the darkened streetlight and the snow-covered ground. Their footprints, fresh, crisp, and unmistakable, they started a few feet behind me and led toward the flickering streetlight. The light blinked once, weakly, casting the street in a pale glow before it went dark again. The whisper came a third time, impossibly close. "James." I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing in the snow. "This isn't funny," I shouted, my voice cracking. The sound echoed down the empty street, fading into nothing. Max barked again, louder this time, and lunged toward the streetlight. The leash slipped through my fingers as he bolted into the dark, his growls echoing in the cold air. "Max!" I yelled, running after him. My boots slipped on the icy pavement as I chased him toward the shadows. The flickering light blinked back on as I reached the edge of its glow, illuminating Max as he stopped suddenly, his body rigid. He stood there, staring into the empty street ahead, his ears pinned back and his tail low. I grabbed his leash, my hand shaking. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Then I saw it. Beneath the streetlight, just beyond the edge of the snowbank, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly still, and cloaked in shadows that rippled around it like smoke. The edges of its form were sharp, too sharp. I couldn't make out a face, just the faint outline of a head and shoulders. "Yo," I managed to choke out. The figure didn't move. The light above us flickered again, and in that brief flash, I thought I saw something glinting, eyes reflecting the weak glow. Max barked once, then backed away, his body trembling. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious, and then the light went out completely. The darkness was absolute. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for my phone. desperate for light. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 3 tries to activate the flashlight. When I finally managed it, the beam cut through the dock, illuminate nothing. The street light was still dark, but the space beneath it was empty. No figure. No footprints leading away, just the snow, untouched and pristine. I didn't wait to see if the light would flicker back on. Gripping Max's leash tightly, I turned and ran, the cold air stinging my face as I sprinted back toward home. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Max paced near the window, his ears twitching as he stared out into the night. I peeked through the curtains, half expecting to see the figure standing under the glow of the next streetlight. But the street was empty, silent except for the soft fall of snow. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the house sent my heart racing. And even now, days later, I can't stop thinking about that whisper, because it wasn't just my name. It was the way it was said, soft, familiar, and so very sure. Like it knew me. The day after New Year's was always a little bittersweet. The holiday magic had faded. The twinkling lights felt out of place, and the tree, once lush and fragrant, was now brittle and dry. Still, the ritual of packing up the decorations brought a sense of closure, like boxing up the old year and making room for the new. I'd started in the living room, carefully wrapping ornaments in tissue paper while the soft hum of a true crime podcast filled the quiet house. The tree stood in the corner, its lights unplugged but still clinging to a few stray needles. I sighed, pulling over the plastic storage bin and reaching for the first strand of garland. That's when I saw it, a small envelope nestled between the branches. At first, I thought it was just another stray Christmas card that had gotten lost in the shuffle, one of the dozens I'd taped to the mantle or tucked into the tree for decoration. But as I pulled it free, a strange chill ran down my spine. The envelope was plain, cream-colored, and sealed. No name, no stamp, no markings at all. My brow furrowed as I turned it over in my hands. Where did this come from? I murmured to myself. I didn't remember putting it there. In fact, I was certain I hadn't. I decorated the tree myself, just as I had every year, and I would have noticed something like this. Wouldn't I? A faint unease prickled at the edges of my thoughts, but I brushed it off. It was probably from one of the kids, I thought, a forgotten school project or a prank meant for their siblings. Smiling faintly at the idea, I slid my nail under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in thirds. I pulled it out, my breath catching as I read the first line. I've been watching you. The words were written in bold, uneven strokes, as though the writer had pressed hard on the pen. My smile faded, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. I scanned the page, hoping for an explanation, but the rest of the letter offered none. The lines were short, deliberate, and chilling. I see everything you do. I know when you're home. I know when you're not. I know who visits. I know when you sleep. My hands trembled as I turned the page over, searching for a name, a clue, anything to explain where this had come from. But there was nothing. Just those sentences, stark and unsettling against the blank paper. I looked back at the envelope, half hoping to find some childish doodle or joke that would deflate the knot of fear tightening in my chest. But it was empty. I stood frozen in the living room, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. A dozen thoughts swirled in my mind, none of them comforting. Who would write this? How had it ended up in my tree? Had someone been in my house? My gaze darted to the front door, then to the windows. Everything was locked, just as I'd left it. But the letter, it had to have come from somewhere. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sharp sound jolting me from my thoughts. I grabbed it quickly, desperate for a distraction, but the screen showed a notification from the neighborhood app. Suspicious activity reported near Elm Street. Elm Street was 3 blocks away. I opened the app, scrolling through the thread. A few neighbors had reported hearing strange noises during the night, knocking on windows, the sound of footsteps in the snow, but no one had seen anything. Someone had posted a grainy photo of footprints leading up to their porch, ending abruptly just outside the door. I set the phone down, my pulse quickening. My house was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive now, as though the walls were holding their breath. I glanced at the tree, at the brittle branches and the faint gap where the envelope had been tucked. Oh my God, what? Stark says, its weaknesses seem to be strengthened over time. Have you had contact with her subjects before? Had someone really been in here, watching me? For how long? The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. I finished taking down the decorations, my movements quick and mechanical, as though completing the task would erase the letter from my mind. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my husband when he came home. I didn't want to worry him. Or maybe I didn't want to admit how much it had shaken me. That night, as I lay in bed, the letter's words replayed in my mind. I know when you sleep. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, staring at the faint shadows on the ceiling. Every creak of the house made me jump, and when the heater kicked on, I nearly screamed. The next morning, I decided to call the police. I felt foolish explaining it to the officer on the phone. A strange letter, no sign of forced entry. But they took me seriously enough to send someone out. The officer who arrived was polite, but didn't seem overly concerned. He dusted the envelope for prints and asked a few questions, but it was clear he didn't expect to find much. It's probably just a prank, he said, handing me back the letter. Kids messing around. Right, I said, forcing a nod, but deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I locked every window and double-checked the doors before going to bed. The house felt like a trap now, its familiar walls hiding secrets I didn't want to uncover. A week passed with no incident. I tried to convince myself it really was just a prank, though the letter stayed tucked in a drawer, its words etched into my mind. Then, one night, I noticed something strange. The tree, still propped against the curb for pickup, was gone. It had been there earlier that day, its brittle branches swing in the wind. But now, under the soft glow of the streetlight, the space was empty. The snow around it was undisturbed, no tracks leading away. I didn't sleep that night, and every year since, when I take down the decorations, I find myself checking every branch, every ornament, every shadow in the house. Because I never found out who left the letter. And I'm afraid one day they'll leave another.